My mother threw my birthday party at the most exclusive restaurant in Chicago. When I arrived, I noticed immediately that there was no seat for me at the table. I asked, with all the composure I could summon, where exactly I was supposed to sit. She took a long, deliberate sip of her champagne, let the silence stretch for maximum effect, and then looked me dead in the eye. "The floor suits you," she said. Everyone at the table laughed at my expense. I did not yell. I did not cause a scene. I turned and left silently, leaving something behind that would change everything. The next day, they turned on the television, and their arrogant smiles disappeared permanently. My name is Sienna, and I am 33 years old. It was a crisp November evening in Chicago. The wind blowing off Lake Michigan was biting and relentless, but the interior of Lille was a masterclass in manufactured warmth and aggressive wealth. Lille was the kind of fine dining establishment where securing a reservation required either a Michelin-starred palate or a massive trust fund. My family unfortunately relied heavily on the latter. I handed my coat to the hostess and made my way toward the private VIP dining room my mother Catherine had reserved for the occasion. You would think a mother booking a luxury VIP room for her daughter's 33rd birthday would be a genuine gesture of love and celebration. But in my family, every grand gesture was merely an opportunity for a carefully staged public performance. I walked down the dim, gold-lit corridor, feeling the familiar tight knot forming in my stomach. For years, I had been the family scapegoat, the designated black sheep who had stubbornly refused to join Vanguard Estates, our family's supposedly prestigious real estate firm. My refusal was treated not as an independent life choice, but as an unforgivable act of betrayal. I pushed open the heavy oak doors to the private room. Before anyone even acknowledged my arrival, the toxic dynamic of my family hit me like a solid physical wall. My mother, Catherine, was standing over the table aggressively directing a visibly terrified waiter on how to perfectly angle the ambient room lighting. She was not doing this to make the space look welcoming for my birthday celebration. She was doing it so the lighting would perfectly illuminate my younger sister Madison. Madison, the undisputed golden child of the family, was pouting her lips at her phone camera, taking an endless stream of selfies for her social media followers. At 30 years old, Madison held the title of vice president at Vanguard Estates, a high-ranking title she had earned entirely by being born to the right parents. She wore a dress plastered with heavy, instantly recognizable designer logos, a deliberate performance of overwhelming wealth that told the room everything she needed people to think about her. Beside her sat her husband, Andre. Andre was a sharp, impeccably dressed corporate lawyer who was completely aligned with my family's toxic brand of extreme arrogance. As I stepped further into the room, I could hear him boasting loudly to my father, Thomas, about a recent legal loophole he had exploited, laughing as he described how his corporate law firm had successfully crushed a small local business in a petty property dispute, as though the destruction of someone's livelihood was an achievement worthy of celebration. My father, the chief financial officer of our family company, nodded along enthusiastically. His weak nature had always made him eager to agree with whoever was being the loudest and most aggressive presence in the room. He had never once, in my living memory, pushed back against the cruelty he witnessed. I stood there for a long moment, quietly observing the people who shared my blood, but knew absolutely nothing about who I truly was. I was wearing a tailored double-breasted blazer and matching trousers. The fabric was Italian silk and wool, custom-made and extraordinarily expensive, but it completely lacked the flashy brand logos my family worshipped. To them, unbranded meant cheap and unsuccessful. To the people in my actual professional circle, it signaled stealth wealth and genuine, unshakable power. I cleared my throat to announce my presence. The reaction was exactly what I had anticipated. My mother stopped harassing the waiter and turned to look at me. Her eyes immediately traveled from my head to my feet in that practiced, surgical way of hers, her expression souring rapidly into a theatrical grimace of extreme disappointment. See, she sighed loudly, her voice thick with condescension. Could you really not make an effort for just one single night? It is your birthday dinner, and you arrive looking like a mid-level office manager running weekend errands. Madison did not even look up from her glowing phone screen, but she chimed in without hesitation. Honestly, it is so embarrassing to be seen with her. Andre chuckled softly, adjusting his luxury watch so the gold caught the light. Leave her alone, Madison, he said, his deep tone dripping with sarcasm and mock sympathy. The startup life is hard. Not everyone can afford to dress like they actually belong somewhere like Lille. I let the deliberate insult wash over me without reacting. Andre genuinely believed I was still running a struggling little consulting business out of a shared co-working space downtown. He loved to remind anyone who would listen that his law degree had bought Madison a $3 million mansion in the suburbs, while my supposed failures meant I was barely scraping by. None of them knew the truth. None of them knew that the startup they constantly mocked had evolved into Apex Holdings, a private equity behemoth quietly controlling billions in commercial assets across the Midwest. They did not know that I was the anonymous founder and CEO, pulling strings across the entire Chicago financial district from the shadows, operating at a level so far above their perception that they would not have believed it if I had told them outright. I offered a polite, close-lipped smile and walked toward the beautifully decorated table. But as I approached the velvet chairs, that smile faltered. I looked around the large circular dining table, counting the formal place settings with growing disbelief. There were exactly 12 chairs, and every single one was occupied. There was no seat left for me, no space, not even an afterthought. It was the ultimate calculated insult, engineered in advance to break my spirit in front of an audience. I stood frozen for a fraction of a second, my eyes scanning the meticulously arranged table. 12 chairs were positioned around the massive mahogany surface, each adorned with a custom-printed name card written in elegant calligraphy. I recognized every name immediately. There was Beatrice, my mother's favorite country club gossip partner. There was Chloe, Madison's personal yoga instructor. There was Marcus, a senior partner at Andre's corporate law firm. Every single seat was occupied by someone from my mother's high society circle, or my sister's carefully curated entourage. There was not a single friend of mine in the room. There was not a single empty seat for the woman whose birthday they were supposedly celebrating. The sheer audacity of the arrangement was breathtaking. My mother had not simply forgotten to add a chair. At Lille, every detail was orchestrated weeks in advance by dedicated event planners. She had specifically instructed the restaurant staff to set the room for 12 guests, knowing full well I would be the 13th arrival. She had designed this entire evening around a single objective, ensuring I would be left standing awkwardly at my own birthday party, publicly humiliated in front of Chicago's elite. I looked directly at my mother. She was watching me closely, her eyes sparkling with dark, hungry anticipation. She was waiting for me to crumble. She wanted the tears, the stuttering, the desperate plea for acceptance that I had given her so many times in childhood. She wanted me to beg for a seat so she could deny me publicly and assert her dominance in front of an audience she had specifically assembled for this purpose. I refused to give her the satisfaction. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping every trace of emotion from my tone. "Mother," I said clearly, my voice cutting through the ambient noise of the private dining room. "I count 12 place settings. Where exactly am I supposed to sit?" The low hum of conversation around the table immediately ceased. The clinking of expensive silverware halted mid-gesture. All 12 guests turned their attention first to me, then to my mother. sensing the impending drama with the practiced radar of people who live for it. This was the exact moment Catherine had been engineering all evening. She did not rush to answer. She picked up her crystal flute of vintage champagne with agonizing slowness, brought it deliberately to her lips, and took a long, composed sip before finally allowing her cold gaze to find mine. A cruel, triumphant smile played at the corner of her mouth. "You have always insisted on doing things your own mediocre way, Sienna," she said, her voice carrying the artificial sweetness that never quite masked its underlying venom. "You refuse to join Vanguard Estates. You refuse to marry a man of proper standing. You chose this difficult, unrewarding path entirely for yourself. So sit on the floor, darling. The floor suits you perfectly." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. I could see Beatrice suddenly become very interested in her linen napkin. A few other guests shifted uncomfortably in their expensive chairs, visibly shocked by the blatant cruelty of a mother publicly telling her own daughter to sit on the ground like a stray animal. But that silence was swiftly broken by the sound of laughter. It started as a sharp giggle from Madison, who briefly covered her mouth in a faint performance of restraint. Within seconds, she dropped the act entirely and laughed openly. Andre joined her immediately, his deep, booming chuckle reverberating off the restaurant walls. Their laughter was infectious to the worst kind of people, and soon several of my mother's friends were chuckling along, validating her monstrous behavior without a shred of guilt or self-awareness. Andre leaned back in his plush velvet chair, swirling the amber liquid in his whiskey glass. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity that he had done absolutely nothing to earn. Madison nodded enthusiastically, reaching over to squeeze his arm with manicured fingers. "Exactly. We all have to earn our seats at the table. You cannot simply expect to be treated like a VIP when you contribute absolutely nothing to the family legacy. Maybe if your little business ever actually turns a profit, we can upgrade you to a folding chair next year." More laughter erupted from their side of the table. They were completely intoxicated by their perceived superiority. They were certain they held all the power, all the wealth, and all the status. They viewed me as a pathetic, stubborn failure who had refused their financial umbrella and was now paying the price for her independence. They thought I was weak. They thought I was entirely defenseless. I looked at Andre, taking in his arrogant posture and the expensive tailored suit he had likely purchased on credit. I knew, as a matter of verifiable fact, that his law firm was currently facing a massive internal audit. I also knew precisely how heavily leveraged Madison's $3 million mansion actually was. The numbers I had studied were not flattering. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I did not beg for a chair, and I certainly did not sit on the floor. I stood there absorbing every ounce of their disrespect, cataloging their cruelty with cold precision, storing it carefully for the absolute surgical execution I was about to deliver upon their falsely perfect lives. The dining room remained suspended in that suffocating pause. They were waiting for my breaking point. They wanted the deep satisfaction of watching my shoulders slump, of seeing my eyes fill, of hearing my voice crack as I made some pathetic excuse to flee. My mother leaned forward slightly, her diamond necklace catching the chandelier light, her eyes hungry for my final surrender. Madison stopped filming on her phone, sensing that the emotional meltdown would be a better story told to friends than captured on video. Andre took another smug sip of his whiskey, entirely confident that his verbal assault had cemented his position as the dominant force in this twisted family hierarchy. I let them enjoy their delusion for exactly 10 seconds. 10 seconds of absolute stillness, during which I memorized every smirk, every dismissive glance, every ounce of their unearned arrogance. Then I moved. I reached into my tailored silk blazer and retrieved a small midnight blue velvet box. It was the gift I had originally brought for my mother. a beautiful token of appreciation purchased before I understood that this dinner was an ambush. Now it served an entirely different purpose. I extended my arm and placed the velvet box gently at the center of the mahogany table, beside a towering floral arrangement. The soft thud of it hitting the wood echoed in the sudden silence. Catherine stared at it, her perfectly arched eyebrows drawing together in sudden confusion. Madison leaned forward, curiosity momentarily overriding her malice. Andre set his glass down with a sharp clink. I looked at my mother and allowed a slow, glacial smile to spread across my face. Not a smile of defeat. Not one of forced politeness. It was the smile of a predator who has just watched the trap close completely around its prey. "You are absolutely right, Mother," I said, my voice carrying with terrifying clarity through every corner of the private dining room. "My place is certainly not at this table. Enjoy the dinner." I turned on my heel and did not look back. I walked down the private corridor with rigid posture and my head held high, pushed open the heavy oak doors, and stepped out into the main restaurant, leaving them behind in their gilded cage of ignorance. The dining area of Liel was a blur of clinking crystal and hushed conversation. I retrieved my coat from the stunned hostess without a word and stepped through the heavy revolving glass doors. The transition was immediate and brutal. The freezing Chicago November air hit my face like a physical blow, stripping away the stifling, perfumed warmth of the restaurant in an instant. The icy wind howled down the magnificent mile, cutting straight through my clothing. But I did not shiver. I felt completely, electrically alive. My heart was pounding, a steady, powerful rhythm against my ribs. There were no tears threatening to fall. There was only the pure rush of adrenaline mixed with absolute calculated clarity. I stood on the sidewalk and let the freezing wind whip my hair around my face. The city lights of Chicago towered above me, a glittering canyon of glass and steel stretching in every direction. This was my city. My family believed they owned a piece of it with their struggling real estate firm, but they were playing with pennies while I controlled the entire vault. I needed a moment to breathe the crisp air and let the finality of my decision settle into my bones. I had given them one last chance, one final opportunity to treat me like a human being, to simply offer me a seat at a table. They had chosen instead to offer me the floor. Now I was going to take the entire building. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and withdrew my secondary phone, a secured, encrypted device unknown to anyone outside my inner circle at Apex Holdings. The screen illuminated my face in the dark street, casting a pale bluish light against the freezing night. I bypassed the biometric security and opened my direct communication channel to my executive team. They were the sharpest, most ruthless financial minds in the city, and they had been on standby for weeks, waiting for my final green light. The Vanguard Estates portfolio had been sitting on my desk for a month. We had analyzed every debt, every leveraged asset, every reckless financial decision my father had made, and my mother had enthusiastically approved. My thumbs moved with surgical precision across the screen. I did not hesitate. The emotional ties that had previously made me pause were cleanly, permanently severed the moment my mother told me to sit on the floor. "Activate the Vanguard Estates hostile takeover protocol. Book me on CNBC for tomorrow morning." I stared at the words for exactly 1 second, reading the sentence that would officially and irrevocably declare war on my own blood. Then I hit send. The encrypted message transmitted instantly. 30 seconds later, delivery confirmations lit up the screen, followed immediately by a reply from my head of public relations. "Protocol engaged. CNBC morning anchor confirmed for 7 a.m. live exclusive. The trap is set." I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The wheels were in motion, and there was absolutely nothing that could stop the financial avalanche that was about to crash down on Catherine, Thomas, Madison, and Andre. Morning sunlight streamed through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the Vanguard family estate. The sprawling mansion, nestled in one of Chicago's most exclusive suburban enclaves, was a towering monument to Catherine and Thomas's relentless pursuit of social dominance. Everything in the grand dining room was designed to project unassailable wealth, from the imported Italian marble flooring to the custom crystal chandelier hanging above the breakfast table. The air was thick with the scent of freshly brewed artisan coffee and a gourmet spread meticulously prepared by their private chef. It was a picture of absolute, undisturbed luxury. They were completely insulated in their fragile bubble of extreme privilege, utterly convinced of their own invincibility. At the head of the long glass table sat Catherine, looking perfectly composed in a designer silk robe worth more than most people earned in a month. She buttered a piece of artisan toast with the calm, deeply satisfied demeanor of a ruthless queen who had successfully defended her golden throne. She had slept wonderfully. Banishing me from the dinner table had undoubtedly been the highlight of her week. Beside her, my father Thomas, the supposed financial mastermind of the family business, casually flipped through a thick stack of printed financial reports, nodding in blind agreement with whatever his wife said, as he had done for as long as I could remember. Across from them, Madison and Andre were gleefully feeding off the lingering toxic energy of the previous night's cruelty. Madison was curating her social media feed, carefully selecting which heavily filtered photos from Lille would garner the most envious comments from her followers. "Can you believe she just walked out?" Madison scoffed, not bothering to look up from her screen. "I honestly thought she was going to cry right there in front of the waiters." She did not even try to fight back. She just left that cheap little box on the table and ran away like a frightened child. Andre chuckled darkly, leaning back in his chair with a display of aggressive ease. He wore a crisp dress shirt and the expression of a man who had never once in his life doubted his own importance. He reached for a warm croissant, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "What did you expect, Madison? She knows she cannot compete with us in any arena. I gave her the reality check she has needed for years. When you are running some failing little project out of a rented desk space, you do not get to sit with the successful adults." She took the exit because it was the only viable option she had left to preserve any shred of dignity. Classic cowardice. Catherine took a delicate sip of her black coffee, her cold eyes gleaming with vindictive pleasure. "Let us not waste our beautiful morning discussing Sienna's dramatic little exit." I offered her a dose of reality. When she wants to be treated like a true member of this family, she needs to act like one. Until her imaginary startup produces something of tangible value, she remains an embarrassing cautionary tale. "Now, Thomas, tell me about the quarterly projections. Beatrice mentioned at the club that the commercial real estate market is softening rapidly." Thomas nervously adjusted his designer reading glasses and shuffled his papers, attempting to project a confidence he did not feel. "Well, Catherine, the market is indeed experiencing a slight downturn. The Vanguard Estates portfolio is currently carrying a rather significant amount of leveraged debt. The loans we took for the new downtown high-rise development are maturing faster than anticipated, and our liquid cash reserves are admittedly tighter than I would prefer." Andre stopped chewing, his sharp legal mind snagging on the phrasing. "Tighter than you prefer, Thomas? Are we looking at a serious liquidity issue? My firm has been hearing ugly rumors about mid-sized developers facing aggressive margin calls from the major banks." Catherine waved her manicured hand dismissively, highly irritated that the pleasant morning was drifting toward anything resembling a genuine problem. "Oh, please, Andre. Do not be dramatic. Vanguard Estates is a legacy institution in this city. We are not some fly-by-night operation that folds under pressure. We have deep historical relationships with every major bank in Chicago. Thomas, restructure the debt immediately. Call Richard at Chase today. He owes us a considerable favor after we sponsored his daughter's charity gala last spring." "Of course, Catherine," Thomas replied hastily. It is simply a temporary cash flow issue. We will refinance the commercial loans against our prime residential properties. The banks know our family name. A little debt is the standard cost of operating at our level. We are perfectly fine. They were completely delusional. They sat in their multi-million-dollar mansion casually discussing millions in toxic debt, as though it were a minor inconvenience that could be dissolved with a phone call to a country club acquaintance. They believed their social status made them financially bulletproof. They genuinely believed the Vanguard name was a magical shield that would forever protect them from the unforgiving realities of the market. They had no idea that I had spent the entire night analyzing every one of those toxic loans, aggressively purchasing Vanguard's distressed commercial debt through anonymous proxy companies, and strategically positioning Apex Holdings to swallow their precious legacy whole. Andre reached for the remote and turned on CNBC. Their shielded reality was ending now. The screen flickered to life, displaying the familiar ticker scrolling across the bottom of the morning broadcast. The volume was low enough not to disrupt their lavish breakfast, but high enough for Andre to catch the headlines. Catherine took another sip of coffee, completely unbothered. Madison tapped away at her phone. Thomas shuffled papers, willfully oblivious to the storm gathering directly over their heads. On the television, the lead anchor, a sharp-looking man with silver hair and a serious demeanor, shuffled his notes and looked directly into the camera. He cut to a breaking news graphic flashing in bright red across the screen. We have a major and entirely unexpected development breaking this morning in the Chicago commercial real estate sector. His voice carried the weight of a financial earthquake. A highly aggressive overnight hostile takeover has just been successfully executed. Apex Holdings, the notoriously secretive private equity firm that has been quietly dominating the Midwest market for the past 5 years, has officially acquired a controlling stake in Vanguard Estates. The name of their family empire echoing from the television speakers caused an instantaneous chilling freeze in the dining room. Thomas dropped his stack of financial reports. The papers scattered across the imported Italian marble like dead leaves. Catherine stopped mid-sip, her porcelain cup hovering motionless inches from her face. Her meticulously applied makeup suddenly unable to conceal the rapid draining of color from her cheeks. Madison slowly lowered her phone, her brow furrowing in deep, uncomprehending confusion. Andre sat bolt upright, his lawyer's instincts snapping into overdrive as he stared at the screen. "What did he just say?" Andre demanded, his voice tight with sudden, unvarnished panic. "Thomas, what exactly is he talking about?" Thomas was frantically patting his pockets, searching for his phone, his hands shaking visibly. "I do not know. That is impossible. We are a private legacy company. No one can acquire a controlling stake without the board's knowledge." On the screen, the anchor continued. Vanguard Estates, a legacy firm long considered a staple of Chicago high society, has apparently been carrying an unsustainable mountain of leveraged toxic debt for years. Sources indicate that Apex Holdings spent the last several weeks aggressively purchasing Vanguard's distressed commercial loans from multiple major banks, effectively cornering the family-run business and executing a flawless predatory acquisition before the market even opened this morning. The anchor paused, leaning slightly forward. But the real story this morning is not simply the acquisition itself. It is the identity of the buyer. For years, the founder and CEO of Apex Holdings has remained entirely anonymous, steering clear of the media and operating exclusively in the shadows of the financial district. His voice dropped by half a register. Today, that changes. Following the successful acquisition of Vanguard Estates, the architect behind this multi-billion-dollar private equity empire has agreed to an exclusive live in-studio interview. Catherine was gripping the edge of the glass table so hard her knuckles had turned stark white. Her breath hitched in her throat. She stared at the screen, her mind working frantically to process how her entire life's work had been stripped away overnight by an entity she had never once considered a threat. The camera angle shifted from the anchor desk to the guest seating area. The bright studio lights illuminated the sleek modern chairs. And sitting there, looking more powerful, more calm, and more effortlessly formidable than anyone in my family had ever managed in their lives of deliberate performance, was me. I was wearing the exact same unbranded silk and wool blazer they had so viciously mocked just 12 hours earlier. My hair was perfectly styled. My posture was impeccable. My eyes looked directly into the camera lens with the quiet, absolute confidence of someone who knows exactly where every piece is on the board. The lower third graphic flashed across the screen. Sienna, founder and CEO, Apex Holdings. Net worth, undisclosed. The sound of shattering porcelain pierced the silence of the dining room. Catherine's fingers had gone completely numb. Her expensive coffee mug slipped from her grasp and smashed into jagged fragments against the marble floor. Dark, scalding coffee splattered across her designer silk robe. She did not flinch. She did not move. She simply sat there, paralyzed, her mouth open in a silent scream of terror, her eyes fixed on my face filling the screen. Madison let out a sharp gasp, her phone clattering onto the glass table as she stared in total disbelief. Andre sprang up from his chair, his eyes wide with a volatile mixture of awe and pure fear, backing away from the table with both hands gripping his hair as his legal mind finally, devastatingly, connected every dot. The anonymous billionaire who had been quietly holding the strings of the Chicago financial district was the same woman he had confidently, publicly told to sit on the floor. Thomas began to hyperventilate, one hand clutching his chest, as the full weight of the reality crashed over him. His daughter, the one they had collectively branded a failure, had just legally purchased everything he had ever built. The arrogant bubble they had inhabited for decades was officially and irreversibly popped. Their unearned pride evaporated instantly as they stared at the screen in collective, speechless disbelief. Madison began to shake, the realization dawning that her luxury lifestyle was now funded entirely by the company I possessed. Andre swallowed hard, cold sweat breaking across his forehead. On the screen, I offered the anchor a warm, unhurried, professional smile. "Good morning," I said smoothly, my voice flowing through the kitchen of the family that had discarded me. "It is a wonderful day in Chicago." The anchor leaned forward, sensing the extraordinary gravity of the moment. He was a veteran of financial journalism, experienced in interviewing billionaires who hid behind carefully rehearsed corporate language. He was entirely unprepared for what I was about to deliver. "Sienna," he began, his tone respectful but pressing. "Vanguard Estates is not just any company. It is a legacy firm deeply embedded in the Chicago social fabric, and more critically, it is a family-run business. The current executive board consists entirely of your immediate family. Your mother, Catherine, serves as CEO. Your father, Thomas, as CFO. Your sister, Madison, as vice president. Now that Apex Holdings has secured a controlling stake, the entire financial sector is asking one very specific question. What is your first move regarding the current leadership team?" In the dining room of the suburban mansion, I knew exactly what was happening. I knew my mother was holding her breath, her heart hammering like a trapped bird behind her ribs. I knew my father was sweating, his weak hands trembling as he stared at the screen. I knew Madison and Andre were paralyzed, their illusions of superiority shattered into a million irreparable fragments. They were waiting, desperately hoping, for me to hesitate, hoping for some sign of lingering familial loyalty they could later exploit. They wanted a compromise, a gentle transition, a face-saving offer that would preserve their precious social standing. They were about to be spectacularly disappointed. I did not break eye contact with the camera. I did not blink. I let the silence hang for 2 full seconds, ensuring every viewer across the country was holding their breath for my next word. Then I let a slow, pristine, utterly lethal smile spread across my face. The exact same smile I had worn when I placed the velvet box on the table at Liel. My first move, Mark, is quite simple, I said, my voice carrying with absolute terrifying clarity. I will be liquidating the current executive board, immediately. The anchor's eyebrows rose sharply. The sheer brutality of the statement, delivered with such precise, unhurried calm, was unprecedented on morning television. Liquidating, Sienna. That is an extraordinarily strong word. Are you saying you intend to terminate your own parents and sister without any transition period whatsoever? I am a businesswoman, Mark. Not a charity. My tone sharpened like a perfectly honed blade. Vanguard Estates has been catastrophically mismanaged for years. It has been treated not as a serious financial institution, but as a personal piggy bank to fund a lifestyle of grotesque, unearned luxury. The current board has accumulated an unsustainable mountain of toxic debt, consistently prioritizing country club memberships and vanity real estate projects over even the most basic fiscal responsibility. That ends today. In the dining room of the estate they had so long believed was untouchable, not one of them said a word. The floor, it turned out, was waiting for them after all. They have not simply mismanaged a legacy company, I said, letting the weight of each word land separately, deliberately. They have driven it to the absolute brink of bankruptcy. I paused, leaning forward slightly, my eyes boring through the camera lens with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment not for theatrical effect, but because every word had been chosen like a surgical instrument. My voice projected straight into the heart of my mother's extravagant kitchen. The kitchen where they had been drinking their artisan coffee and laughing about my blazer less than 24 hours ago. I did not acquire Vanguard Estates to preserve a failing family dynasty. The words landed like hammer blows, measured and merciless. I acquired it because beneath the suffocating layers of incompetence and arrogance, there are valuable core assets that my team at Apex Holdings can restructure and return to genuine profitability. But that restructuring cannot begin, cannot even be contemplated, as long as the current leadership remains anywhere near the building. I straightened slightly, allowing the silence to do its work, before I delivered the sentence I had been building toward since the moment I stepped out of Lille into the freezing November air. So yes, effective immediately, Catherine, Thomas, and Madison are terminated from all positions within the company. Their access badges have already been deactivated. Their corporate accounts have been permanently frozen. The anchor seemed momentarily stunned, visibly struggling to maintain his professional composure in the face of such a ruthless and entirely public family execution. "And what about their severance, Sienna?" he managed, his voice carefully measured. "Surely, given their long tenure and their direct family connection to the founder, there will be some form of compensation, a dignified exit package at the very least." My smile widened. It transformed into something precise and quietly dangerous. I had been waiting precisely 24 hours to deliver the next sentence. I had rehearsed it in my mind while staring out at the freezing Chicago skyline from my penthouse window, alone with the city and the certainty of what was coming. Now I was broadcasting it to the entire nation. "There will be absolutely no severance packages," I stated, my voice flat and final as a door closing. "They have already extracted far more wealth from that company than they ever legitimately earned. As for a dignified exit," I let the ghost of a smile touch my lips, "I believe I have provided them with the exact level of dignity they deserve. They are welcome to go to the office, pack their personal belongings into cardboard boxes, and sit on the floor while they do it. After all, the floor suits their level of competence perfectly." The studio fell dead silent. Even the camera operators seemed to stop breathing. It was a moment of epic, irreversible finality. A brutal and meticulously crafted dismantling of my family's entire fabricated reality, broadcast live to millions. I had taken the precise words my mother had used to humiliate me in front of Chicago's elite and weaponized them, launching them back at her with the full crushing weight of a multi-billion-dollar financial empire behind every syllable. I knew that right at that moment, in their sprawling suburban mansion, my family was experiencing the true and devastating cost of underestimating me. The broadcast cut to commercial. But the execution was already complete. The queen was dead. The golden child was dethroned. And the scapegoat now owned the entire kingdom. The silence in the dining room stretched thick and suffocating long after the screen cut away. The scent of artisan coffee and warm croissants, once a comforting symbol of their insulated, untouchable luxury, now felt nauseatingly heavy in the stagnant air. No one moved. No one spoke. They were 4 people trapped in the immediate, catastrophic aftermath of a financial bomb going off in their own living room, surrounded by the debris of everything they had believed about themselves and about me. Then the shrill ring of a cell phone shattered the quiet. Thomas jolted violently, nearly knocking over his chair as he scrambled for his phone, which had slid off the table and landed face down among the scattered financial reports on the floor. He grabbed it with visibly trembling hands, his face paling several shades further as he read the caller ID. It was his lead accountant at Vanguard Estates. Thomas swiped to answer and pressed the phone to his ear, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes. What is it?" The voice on the other end was frantic, loud enough for everyone seated at the table to hear the rising, barely contained panic beneath every word. "Mr. Thomas, sir. It's the banks. All of them. The corporate accounts have been frozen. Every single line of credit, every operational fund, every reserve account. Everything. We cannot even process payroll." Thomas collapsed back into his chair, the phone slipping fractionally from his loosening grip. "Frozen? What do you mean, frozen? Call Richard at Chase Bank immediately. Tell him there has been a mistake. Tell him it is urgent." "I did, sir," the accountant replied, his voice cracking audibly under the weight of what he had to deliver. "Richard said he cannot help us. He said the orders came directly from the new controlling entity, Apex Holdings. They have enacted a total financial lockdown pending a comprehensive forensic audit. And, sir," a brief, terrible pause, "there is more." Catherine, who had remained absolutely motionless since her coffee mug shattered on the marble floor, suddenly snapped back to life. Her survival instincts, honed and sharpened by decades of cutthroat social climbing and calculated ruthlessness, overrode the shock in an instant. She reached across and snatched the phone from Thomas's weakening grip with decisive ferocity, her eyes blazing. "What else?" she demanded. "Speak clearly." "It's the access badges, ma'am." The accountant's voice was thin with barely suppressed fear. "Security has just informed me that the entire executive team's keycards have been deactivated as of this morning. They have been instructed to escort you off the premises should you attempt to enter the building." A fractional, devastated pause. "You've been locked out of Vanguard Estates, ma'am." Catherine ended the call without another word. She set the phone down on the glass table with a hard, sharp clatter that rang through the silence like a gunshot. Her chest heaved with the effort of controlled breathing. Her perfectly manicured nails dug deep into the edge of the table, the knuckles beneath them bone white. The reality of my broadcast was manifesting with terrifying, surgical speed. I had not spoken empty threats on national television. I had issued a live announcement of an execution that had already been carried out hours earlier, while they were still sleeping. Andre, who had remained frozen in his chair since the broadcast ended, suddenly rose and began pacing the full length of the dining room. His usually immaculate posture had collapsed entirely, replaced by frantic, erratic movement. The restless energy of a man whose carefully constructed world was disintegrating around him in real time. He ran both hands through his hair repeatedly, his sharp legal mind racing, frantically connecting the devastating dots that had been concealed in plain sight for years. "It all makes sense now," Andre muttered, his voice tight and rising with barely suppressed panic. The anonymous proxy buyers, the aggressive debt consolidation, the sudden, inexplicable shifts in the Chicago commercial real estate market over the past 2 years. He stopped pacing abruptly and turned to face Madison, his eyes wide and slightly wild with the horror of full comprehension. Apex Holdings was not just a competitor circling the market, it was a predator. It had been systematically and patiently circling the weakest herd for years, and we were the herd. He stared at Madison, his voice dropping to something closer to disbelief. "Do you understand what she has done? That little startup she claimed to be running? It was never a consulting firm. It was a multi-billion-dollar private equity behemoth operating entirely in the dark. She has been building a financial empire right beneath our noses, right beneath this table, while we were busy making fun of her blazer." Madison shook her head, her jaw tight with resistance. "No. No, that is impossible. Sienna is a... This cannot be what it looks like. Someone else has to be pulling the strings. She is just a front. She does not have the capital or the connections to execute something like this. She is the founder and CEO of Apex Holdings, Madison." Andre's voice cracked sharply, the last vestiges of his composed, untouchable corporate lawyer persona finally gone. "Did you not just watch the same broadcast I did? She legally owns Vanguard Estates. She owns the company that pays my firm's retainers. She owns the company whose assets guarantee the mortgage on our $3 million house." His voice dropped to something raw and hollow. "If Vanguard goes into liquidation, if she cancels the vendor contracts and dissolves the asset base, we are ruined. Do you hear me? Completely and entirely ruined." The word hung in the air of the grand dining room like a detonated charge, its reverberations touching every surface. Ruined. It meant losing the mansion and the cars. It meant surrendering the country club memberships and the designer wardrobes and the private chefs and the social invitations. It meant the total and permanent collapse of the facade they had spent their entire lives constructing and defending. It meant becoming, in every way that mattered to them, everything they had always despised and feared most: ordinary. Catherine slammed her open palm onto the glass table. The sharp crack silenced Andre's spiral instantly. She rose from her seat, her spine rigid, her eyes burning with a furious and unyielding denial. She had not survived decades of cutthroat social warfare by accepting defeat when it presented itself. She refused, on a visceral, almost physical level, to believe that the daughter she had deemed worthless, mediocre, and unworthy of a chair at her own birthday dinner had outsmarted and thoroughly outmaneuvered her. "Enough," Catherine commanded, her voice slicing through the rising hysteria with the precision of long practice. "I will not stand here and listen to this pathetic whining. We are the Vanguard family. We built this city's real estate landscape from nothing. I will not allow some ungrateful, spiteful child to steal my life's work through cowardly, backdoor financial manipulation." She turned to Thomas, who was staring blankly at the shattered porcelain fragments still scattered across the marble floor. "Thomas, get up, call the legal team, tell them to draft an emergency injunction to halt any further action by Apex Holdings. We will tie her up in litigation until she begs for a settlement." Thomas looked up at her with hollow, devastated eyes. "Catherine," he whispered, his voice barely holding itself together. "I do not think you understand the position we are in. The banks have already frozen every account. We do not have the liquid capital to pay the retainer for a legal team capable of fighting a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm in court. We are locked out of our own building. We have nothing liquid left to fight with. Catherine's eyes narrowed. A dangerous, desperate, calculating glint replaced the shock that had momentarily overtaken her expression. Then we handle this directly, she said, her voice low and sharp. She thinks she can hide behind a television screen and an army of corporate lawyers. She thinks she can humiliate me in front of the entire nation and simply disappear. She reached for her designer handbag from the chair beside her, her movements jerky and driven by pure, unprocessed rage. Madison, get your coat. Andre, get the car. We are going to her address right now. I do not care if she is in a rented office closet or a luxury building. We are going to find her, and we are going to put her back in her place. She is going to learn precisely what happens when you cross this family. The drive from the sprawling suburban estate to downtown Chicago was a masterclass in suffocating, unspoken tension. Catherine sat perfectly rigid in the passenger seat of Andre's aggressively leased Mercedes, her knuckles bone-white against the designer leather of her handbag. She stared straight ahead at the highway, jaw set, refusing to acknowledge the profound and publicly witnessed humiliation that had just been broadcast live across the nation. Thomas sat in the back seat, silently sweating, his mind performing increasingly desperate calculations. How many days remained before their creditors moved from frozen accounts to seizing physical assets? The number kept arriving smaller than he needed it to be. Madison was frantically deleting comments from her social media accounts, her carefully curated influencer persona crumbling in real time as the news of the Vanguard takeover spread like wildfire through her shallow, status-obsessed circle. Every notification was another crack in the facade. Andre drove with reckless, barely contained fury, his knuckles tight on the wheel. He was running legal strategies through his mind at speed, genuinely convincing himself that he could use the weight of his corporate law degree and the aggression of his delivery to intimidate me into backing down. He believed, with the full force of his enormous ego, that he could walk into whatever modest shared office space he assumed I operated from and deploy enough legal jargon and professional menace to force a negotiated retreat. He had no idea where the GPS was taking them. I had always ensured that any mail or official documents forwarded to my family went through a P.O. box or a discreet forwarding service. They had never once known my actual address. It was one of many small, deliberate precautions I had maintained for years, not out of shame, but out of strategy. When the GPS finally announced their arrival, Andre brought the car to a sharp, jerky stop at the curb. He stared through the windshield, his confident expression faltering for the first time since they had left the house. Catherine leaned forward instinctively, her eyes traveling upward along the face of the structure before them, narrowing as they climbed higher and higher. "This cannot be right," she said, her voice taut with disbelief. "The GPS has malfunctioned. She would not be located here." They were parked directly in front of the Azure, one of the most exclusive ultra-luxury residential and commercial high-rises in the heart of Chicago's Gold Coast. The building was a masterpiece of contemporary architecture, a gleaming spire of glass and steel rising above the lakefront with the effortless authority of something built not to impress, but simply to exist at a level most people never accessed. It was known throughout the city as a fortress for billionaires, home to tech founders, international diplomats, hedge fund titans, and the occasional quietly powerful figure whose name appeared in no directories. It was precisely the kind of address Catherine had spent her entire career desperately, unsuccessfully, trying to secure a piece of for Vanguard Estates. Andre double-checked the address I had deliberately provided to the Vanguard accountants during the corporate account freeze. The only registered address on file for Apex Holdings. The numbers matched exactly. "This is the address she provided," Andre said, his voice stripped of a significant portion of its earlier bravado. "It is the only registered address we have." Catherine scowled, her jaw working against the reality presenting itself with perfect clarity before her. She is probably renting a small office on the ground floor to project importance, or using it as a mailing address. Get out of the car. We are going inside. The family stepped out onto the pavement, their collective arrogance momentarily reasserting itself as they approached the grand, polished brass entrance doors of the Azure. They moved the way they always moved through spaces they believed they were entitled to, with the expectation of immediate deference, of doors opening before they reached them, of staff recognizing the social weight they carried simply by existing. Catherine marched directly toward the massive semicircular concierge desk, her designer heels striking the imported marble with sharp, impatient precision. "Excuse me," she announced, dispensing entirely with a greeting. "We are here to see Sienna. She is my daughter. Inform her that her family has arrived and that we expect to be brought up immediately." The head concierge, a meticulously groomed man named Harrison, who had in his career serenely managed the arrivals and demands of heads of state, celebrated artists, and the quietly obscene wealthy Hach, did not flinch at her tone. He calmly consulted his digital registry, his expression remaining perfectly, professionally neutral. "I am sorry, madame," Harrison replied, with the smooth, unruffled courtesy of someone who has never once been moved by aggression. "I do not have a visitor request registered under your name. Access to the residential floors is strictly prohibited without prior authorization from the penthouse owner." Catherine's palm hit the marble desk with a sharp crack that drew the attention of every person in the lobby. "Do not play games with me. I am Catherine, CEO of Vanguard Estates. Former CEO, perhaps by some legal technicality, but this woman is my daughter. You will grant us access immediately, or I will ensure your management company hears in considerable detail about your gross incompetence." Harrison did not blink. He raised his eyes from his screen with the precise, unhurried calm of a man who has heard every variation of this speech and been moved by none of them. "Madam, as of this morning, Vanguard Estates is a wholly owned subsidiary of Apex Holdings. The owner of the penthouse, who is also the founder and CEO of Apex Holdings, has placed a strict security hold on her residence. You are not on the approved visitor list. I must ask you to step away from the desk." Madison stepped forward, defaulting instinctively to the entitled aggression that had always worked for her everywhere else. "You are a glorified doorman. Do you have any concept of who we are? We are not leaving until we see her." Andre, drawing himself to his full height and adopting the practiced authority of a senior partner entering a deposition, leaned across the desk. "Listen to me very carefully. I am a senior corporate attorney, and you are unlawfully impeding our access to a family member during an active and critical business dispute. If you do not allow us access to that elevator immediately, I will personally ensure you are buried in litigation for the remainder of your professional life." Harrison pressed a discreet button beneath the surface of the desk without looking down. Within seconds, 4 immaculate, broad-shouldered security personnel materialized from the subdued shadows of the lobby, moving with the silent, synchronized precision of people who do this without drama and without hesitation. They formed a solid, impenetrable wall between my family and the private elevators, their presence making every argument in the lobby immediately irrelevant. "Sir," the lead guard said, his voice carrying the deep, final authority of someone who has no interest in repeating himself. "You are currently trespassing in a private, secured residential building. If you do not vacate the lobby immediately and voluntarily, we will remove you from the premises and contact the Chicago Police Department." The silence that followed was the particular, devastating kind that arrives when every exit has been closed. Catherine Sau, who had spent the better part of 4 decades demanding VIP treatment in every room she entered, who had built an identity around the assumption that her name alone opened doors, was being quietly, efficiently, and publicly treated as a security concern. Madison shrank back, her social bravado dissolving as she registered that her status, her followers, her carefully curated image meant precisely nothing inside these walls. Andre's mouth opened and closed as his practiced legal threats died one by one in the face of four calm, immovable men who were simply doing their jobs. Thomas stood slightly apart from the group, already mentally somewhere else entirely, already quietly preparing himself for what came next. They were completely, utterly powerless. They stood in one of the most prestigious lobbies in Chicago, staring at the elevator bank they could not access, held at the threshold of a world they had never known existed. A world I had built quietly and entirely on my own, and the truth of it was finally, irreversibly, landing. 40 stories above them, I sat in the expansive, sun-flooded living room of my penthouse. The walls were floor-to-ceiling glass on three sides, offering an unobstructed, breathtaking view of Lake Michigan, vast, churning, and indifferent, stretching all the way to the horizon. I held a tablet in one hand, watching the high-definition security feed from the lobby in real time. I watched my mother's face cycle through fury, calculation, and something approaching the first real tremor of fear. I watched Andre's carefully rehearsed legal intimidation fail so completely and so quickly that the gap between his expectation and his reality was almost architectural. I watched Madison look small in a way she had never looked small before. I watched them understand, perhaps for the first time in their lives, what it felt like to stand at a door that would not open for them. I let them absorb the full weight of it for 3 uninterrupted minutes. Then I tapped a button on the tablet, opening a direct audio channel to Harrison at the concierge desk. "Harrison," I said, my voice clear and unhurried in his earpiece. "You may send them up. The family only. Please ensure they are escorted directly to the private elevator." A brief pause. "Let us finish this." I set the tablet down on the marble coffee table and rose from the sofa. I smoothed the lapels of my unbranded silk blazer with both hands, drew a slow breath, and looked out at the lake. The opening act was complete. The board had been cleared. Every piece was exactly where I had placed it. Now it was time for the final movement. The private elevator doors glided open with a soft, precise chime, releasing the four of them into the vast expanse of my penthouse. Morning light poured through the wraparound windows, moving across the polished hardwood floors and the clean, deliberate lines of the modern art on the walls. The panoramic view of Lake Michigan filled the far wall like a living painting, endless, luminous, entirely indifferent to the small dramas of small people. I stood behind my white marble kitchen island, hands resting flat on its cool surface, watching them arrive. Catherine stepped off the elevator first. Her designer heels clicked against the hardwood. And then, in the space of a single step across the threshold, her entire presentation shifted with a speed and completeness that would have impressed me if I had not grown up watching her perform it my entire life. The furious, entitled woman who had just attempted to bully my concierge vanished. In her place appeared a masterwork of manufactured maternal vulnerability. Shoulders softened, expression carefully rearranged into something approximating tender concern, eyes shimmering with the precise quantity of unshed tears she had calculated would be most effective. It was a performance I had witnessed hundreds of times across the years, weaponized emotion designed not to communicate feeling, but to neutralize opposition. Madison followed closely, looking uncharacteristically diminished as her eyes swept the room, absorbing the staggering, quiet wealth surrounding her. Wealth that bore no logos, announced itself through no obvious signals, and was therefore, to her trained eye, even more disorienting than something she could simply price. Andre stepped out last, his gaze moving in quick, involuntary calculations across every object in the room. the desperate mental arithmetic of a man who has just realized he has been operating in entirely the wrong league. Thomas remained near the elevator, a silent, perspiring shadow who had largely given up the project of pretending. "Sienna, darling," Catherine breathed, her voice calibrated to the exact frequency of agonized maternal love. She took a small, tentative step forward, hands clasped at her chest. "I am so relieved we found you. We have been out of our minds since you left the restaurant last night. What happened on the broadcast this morning?" A solitary tear traced a careful path down her cheek. "It was shocking to us, sweetheart. Truly shocking. But I know you. I know my own daughter. You are hurting, and you have every right to be. I will admit, my behavior at the restaurant was harsh. It was inexcusable, but you must understand it came from a place of deep and genuine love." Madison produced a small, involuntary scoff. A sharp look from Andre silenced her instantly. They needed Catherine's approach to work. It was the last viable strategy remaining to them. "It was tough love, Sienna," Catherine continued, her voice thickening with layered false emotion as she took another step closer. "Your father and I have always known you possess this extraordinary, untapped potential. We have always believed you were capable of something remarkable. But you were so stubborn, so determined to struggle independently, to refuse every hand we extended. I pushed you last night because I wanted to ignite something in you. I wanted to force you to finally stand up and claim the power you were always capable of wielding." She spread her hands in a gesture of proud, reverent admiration. "And look at what you have accomplished, my brilliant, brilliant girl. I am so incredibly proud of you." The sheer architectural audacity of the gaslighting was genuinely breathtaking. In under 60 seconds, she had attempted a complete rewrite of recent history, transforming a calculated, publicly executed humiliation into a deliberate act of maternal inspiration. She was, with full sincerity and zero self-awareness, attempting to retroactively take credit for a decade of grinding, solitary work I had done, entirely despite her, not because of her. And she genuinely believed it would work. She genuinely believed that if she produced the right quantity of tears and invoked the inviolable sanctity of family blood, I would soften, forgive, and hand Vanguard Estates back to her with an apology for the inconvenience. But this was not about family anymore. This was a hostile takeover. And the window for emotional manipulation had been permanently closed. I did not raise my voice. I did not allow her performance to touch any surface in me that was still capable of being moved. I reached beneath the marble island and withdrew a thick, heavy leather-bound dossier, its cover embossed in gold with the Apex Holdings insignia. I slid it across the smooth marble surface with a single, even movement. It stopped precisely an inch from the edge, directly in front of her. "You can stop the performance, Catherine," I said, my voice carrying with the cold, exact precision of someone who has no further use for theater. "The cameras are off. The audience is gone. There is no one left in this room to manipulate." Catherine stared at the dossier. The shimmer of unshed tears evaporated instantly. The mask of the loving, wounded mother slipped away, revealing beneath it the thing it had always been covering, a cornered CEO. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice stripped of its trembling vulnerability and returned to its native sharpness. "That," I replied, my tone as smooth and final as the closing of a vault, "is a comprehensive forensic accounting of Vanguard Estates, conducted over the past month by my senior financial analysts at Apex Holdings. I suggest you open it." Andre, his legal instincts overriding everything else, stepped forward and lifted the heavy leather cover. His eyes moved quickly across the first page, his brow furrowed with gathering concentration, then with gathering dread. Madison leaned in over his shoulder, attempting to follow the dense columns of financial data, Thomas remained exactly where he was, beside the elevator, unwilling to walk toward the physical, documented proof of his own catastrophic failures as CFO. As Andre turned the pages, the color drained from his face with the steady, progressive efficiency of something being emptied. The dossier was a meticulous, irrefutable chronicle of institutional ruin. Every toxic loan, every leveraged asset, every disastrous capital decision made under Catherine's leadership was documented in granular clinical detail. But more than that, it traced the origin of every hemorrhage, the precise moment, the precise decision, the precise signature. "Let me save you the time of reading the executive summary," I said, leaning forward slightly, commanding the complete and undivided attention of everyone in the room. Vanguard Estates is not suffering from a temporary market correction, as my father suggested this morning. Vanguard Estates is bleeding to death. And the source of the bleeding is standing in my penthouse. Catherine's jaw tightened. "That is a lie. I have guided this company through multiple full market recessions. I am the brand. You are the reason this brand is weeks away from a Chapter 11 filing." My voice sharpened without rising. "The audit documents it precisely. Over the past 5 years, you have treated Vanguard's corporate operational accounts as a personal fund. The renovations to the suburban estate, the aggressive expansion into luxury market verticals that produced zero measurable return, the relentless and escalating expenditure required to maintain your social standing among Chicago's elite. You leveraged the core assets of this company to finance your own vanity, Catherine. You mortgaged the future of an institution your father spent 30 years building so you could maintain your membership at the right club and be photographed at the right galas." Andre looked up from the dossier, his expression stripped of every layer of professional composure. He turned to Thomas. "Is this true? Are we genuinely this over-leveraged?" Thomas could not meet his son-in-law's eyes. He stared at the floor. The silence was its own confirmation. "The mathematics do not lie," I said, pressing 2 fingers onto the marble for emphasis. "Your debt-to-equity ratio is catastrophic. The major banks were already preparing margin calls when I moved. If Apex Holdings had not stepped in and aggressively purchased your distressed debt before those calls were issued, Vanguard Estates would have been dismantled publicly in bankruptcy court before the end of this quarter." I held Catherine's gaze without blinking. "I did not steal your company, Catherine. I salvaged it from the wreckage of your own crippling vanity. The only reason your family name has not already been dragged through the financial press is because I moved first." Catherine stared at me across the marble surface of the island, the last architecture of her self-belief, the impenetrable certainty of her own superiority, her infallibility, her unassailable social power, cracked with an almost audible sound. She stood in my $15 million penthouse, staring at the irrefutable, meticulously sourced evidence that she had personally and systematically destroyed everything she claimed to have built, and that the daughter she had told to sit on the floor was the only reason any of it still existed at all. The silence that followed spread thick and total through the sunlit room, pressing against every surface. Thomas swayed slightly on his feet, looking physically unwell. Madison gripped Andre's arm with both hands, her eyes moving frantically between the dossier and my face, searching for some remaining angle, some overlooked exit. Andre turned from the last page of the dossier, closed the leather cover carefully, and set it back on the marble with the precise, controlled movements of a man who is managing an enormous and dangerous internal pressure. Then he straightened. He adjusted his tie with a single, sharp, aggressive movement. The shock that had paralyzed him was receding, and what was replacing it was something faster and harder. Desperation wearing the mask of offense. He stepped away from Madison, rolling his shoulders back. When he was cornered, his instinct had always been to attack. It was the only mode he fully trusted. "You think you are untouchable?" Andre said, his voice descending once more into condescension with the ease of long practice. You executed a stealth acquisition and assembled some spreadsheets in a spectacular apartment, and now you believe you are a titan of industry. He shook his head slowly, his eyes narrowed. You have no idea what you are dealing with. I have restructured companies 10 times the size of Apex Holdings before my morning coffee. I remained perfectly still. I watched him expand, and I said nothing. This was not a standard acquisition, he continued, his voice rising as he began to pace again, the frantic energy returning. This was a predatory hostile takeover executed with a deliberate, systematic lack of transparency and a blatant disregard for fiduciary duty. The speed of execution, the anonymity maintained throughout, the aggressive accumulation of distressed debt through proxy entities. He stopped pacing and pointed a single manicured finger directly at me, his eyes narrowing to something bright and desperate. It all reeks of market manipulation, unethical business practice, potential violations of the Securities Exchange Act. I am going to file an emergency injunction before the ink on your acquisition papers is fully dry. I will petition the court to freeze every asset connected to Apex Holdings pending a full federal investigation, predatory lending practices, tortious interference with contractual business relationships, gross violations of securities law. His voice had reached its full prosecutorial register now, filling the room. You will spend the next 3 years buried in deposition, Sienna, while your asset base erodes and your investors flee. By the time the courts are finished with you, there will be nothing left worth keeping. Madison, sensing a shift in the room's momentum, or believing she did, straightened her posture and allowed her familiar smirk to resurface. You hear that? You thought you were untouchable. But you just handed Andre everything he needs to dismantle you completely. You are going to lose everything you built. Andre did not even acknowledge her support. He was watching me, waiting, needing to see the fear arrive in my face. I let the room stay quiet for a long moment. Then I reached beneath the island a second time. He was entirely consumed by a singular, burning need to tear me down, to prove, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that his Ivy League credentials and meticulously curated corporate pedigree made him infinitely superior to the woman he had so casually instructed to sit on the floor. And that is merely the corporate side of the litigation, Andre added, his voice dropping to a menacingly low, almost theatrical register. We are also going to file a massive civil suit against you personally, intentional infliction of emotional distress, defamation of character, harassment. We will argue that your entire acquisition strategy was driven not by any legitimate business interest, but by a sick, vindictive vendetta against your own family. We will paint you as a bitter, deeply unstable woman who weaponized her ill-gotten wealth to orchestrate a very public execution of her own parents. He leaned forward, resting both hands flat on the marble island, his face inches from the open dossier. The media will absolutely eat it up. Sienna, the brilliant anonymous billionaire, exposed at last as a petty, vindictive sociopath. Your investors will flee. Your board will turn on you. I will personally drag you through depositions and discovery for the next decade. I will bury you under so much litigation that you will be begging for a settlement just to cover your legal fees. I will bleed you and your little company completely, utterly dry. The performance was masterful in its own hollow way. He threw every intimidating legal term he could summon, attempting to construct a towering fortress of jargon and calculated threats around his profoundly fragile ego. He genuinely believed that if he sounded aggressive enough, if he projected sufficient certainty and righteous fury, I would cower in fear and hand Vanguard estates back to his family, simply to avoid the mounting hassle of a prolonged legal war. He expected me to argue. He expected me to defend my acquisition strategy, to counter his legal threats with threats of my own, to descend into a messy, emotional screaming match that would validate every word of his carefully crafted narrative about the bitter, unstable daughter. I did not give him the satisfaction of a single syllable. I let his threats echo through the vast open space of the penthouse. I let him bask in his imagined victory for exactly 5 seconds. I studied the smug, self-congratulatory satisfaction radiating from his face, and I felt absolutely nothing but cold, clinical anticipation. He had presented his opening argument. Now it was time for the verdict. I did not blink. I did not shift my weight or offer a single syllable of defense against his barrage of legal intimidation. I simply reached across the cool marble surface of the kitchen island and picked up my slim silver tablet. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath, completely unnerved by my absolute, unbroken lack of reaction. Andre's arrogant smirk began to falter. Just slightly, just at the very corners of his mouth. As the heavy silence stretched far beyond any reasonable point of comfort. He had expected fire and brimstone. He had anticipated a desperate, emotional defense he could systematically pick apart with his sharp lawyer logic. Instead, he found himself facing a glacier. I tapped a single icon on the glass screen. A soft mechanical whirring sound resonated from somewhere in the ceiling above the expansive living area. A massive high-definition projector screen descended smoothly from a concealed slot, rolling down to cover the panoramic view of Lake Michigan entirely. The sudden blockage of natural sunlight cast a sharp, cinematic shadow across the penthouse, instantly transforming the luxurious residential space into something that felt like a sterile, high-stakes corporate boardroom. The sophisticated projector flickered to life, casting a bright, crisp rectangle of glaring white light across the room. Every eye snapped toward the screen. Catherine, Thomas, Madison, and Andre all turned simultaneously, expecting to see more internal Vanguard operational data, or perhaps a complex diagram of Apex Holdings' corporate structure. What illuminated the screen had absolutely nothing to do with standard corporate acquisitions or real estate market trends. It was a highly detailed, meticulously organized spreadsheet displaying international wire transfers, hidden routing numbers, and offshore corporate entity registrations. The distinctive logos of discrete banking institutions located in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas were prominently displayed at the very top of the financial documents. Andre took a staggering step backward. The blood drained completely from his face. His perfectly maintained tan turned a sickly, ashen gray within seconds. His jaw slackened. The aggressive, posturing corporate lawyer vanished entirely, replaced in an instant by a terrified, cornered animal staring directly into the headlights of oncoming traffic. He knew exactly what he was looking at. "You are a very skilled orator, Andre," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the quiet, shadowed room. "You throw around complex legal terms like fiduciary duty and market manipulation with incredible conviction. You demand absolute transparency and rigorously ethical specific series of repetitive wire transfers, highlighting the staggering dollar amounts in bright, undeniable crimson ink. We found some genuinely fascinating discrepancies. I continued stepping around the marble island, walking slowly, deliberately toward him. We discovered a remarkably consistent pattern of authorized payments sent directly from Vanguard operational accounts to a mysterious series of shell companies registered in the Caribbean. Shell companies that, after a very brief investigation conducted by my private intelligence contractors, were directly and inextricably linked to your personal Social Security number. Thomas let out a choked, wet gasp and finally looked up from the floor. He stared at the giant screen, his eyes widening in visible horror as his sluggish mind processed the familiar routing numbers he had personally signed off on month after month, entirely unaware of their true and devastating destination. "Over the past 2 years," I stated, my voice echoing across the room like a judge delivering a final death sentence, "you have systematically embezzled $2 million from Vanguard Estates. You drained my family's struggling company to feed a severe, spiraling underground gambling addiction. You used fabricated legal retainers and phantom consulting fees to cover your massive, humiliating losses at illegal high-stakes poker games across the Midwest." Andre opened his mouth to speak, to deny it, to spin some miraculous and complicated legal lie that might save his skin. But his voice completely failed him. He was suffocating under the crushing, unbearable weight of his own criminal exposure. Madison stared at the glowing screen, her eyes darting frantically between the offshore account balances and the terrifyingly large gambling debts listed right beside them. Her expensive designer handbag slipped from her shoulder and hit the hardwood floor with a dull, heavy thud. The pristine, flawless narrative of her perfect marriage was disintegrating right before her eyes. The $3 million mansion, the luxury cars, the endless, obnoxious social media bragging about her husband's elite corporate success. It was all a complete illusion, built entirely on a foundation of theft and degenerate addiction. I walked to the marble coffee table and picked up a sleek black folder. I pulled out 2 separate thick stacks of paper and dropped them onto the glass surface directly in front of Andre. "There are 2 distinct documents on this table, Andre," I said, pointing to the crisp white papers. "The first is a full, unconditional resignation from your prestigious corporate law firm, explicitly acknowledging your gross ethical violations. The second is a set of fully drafted divorce papers, irrevocably severing your marriage to my sister and completely waiving any future claim to spousal support or Vanguard assets." I pulled my secondary phone from my blazer pocket and held it up so he could clearly see the screen. "I have an encrypted digital file containing every single piece of evidence currently displayed on that projector. It is loaded and currently addressed to the White-Collar Crime Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, as well as the Illinois State Bar Association." I tapped the timer application on the screen and set it for exactly 1 minute. I pressed start. "You have exactly 60 seconds, Andre," I said, my tone absolute, cold, and entirely unyielding. "Sign the resignation and the divorce papers. Today, right now, or this highly damaging file goes directly to the FBI. You will be completely disbarred by tomorrow morning, and you will be facing severe federal prison time for wire fraud and major embezzlement before the end of the week." The digital timer ticked down silently on my phone screen, a terrifying countdown to his total personal and professional destruction. 50 seconds. 45. Andre lunged toward the glass table, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grip the silver pen I had left beside the documents. He did not read the terms. He did not attempt to negotiate or plead for mercy. He frantically scribbled his signature across the bottom of both stacks of paper, tears of absolute panic and crushing defeat streaming freely down his face. He dropped the pen, gasping for air as though he had been submerged in freezing water. Madison stared at the man she had worshipped, the man she had wielded for years to belittle and humiliate me. He was a thief, a liar, and an absolute coward. A raw, guttural scream tore from her throat, shattering the tension that had accumulated in the room like pressure before a storm. She launched herself forward and slapped Andre across the face with everything she had. The sharp, violent crack of her palm against his cheek echoed through the penthouse. The golden couple was dead, destroyed in a single irrevocable instant, leaving nothing but the pathetic, shattered pieces of their fabricated reality scattered across my floor. Madison did not stop with a single slap. She shoved Andre hard against the edge of the marble island, her perfectly manicured nails tearing at the expensive fabric of his suit jacket. She screamed at him, demanding to know how he could have been so incredibly stupid as to steal from her own mother. Andre did not fight back. He kept his head down, snatched the signed resignation and divorce papers, and stumbled backward toward the private elevator. He jabbed the descent button frantically, refusing to look at his soon-to-be ex-wife or the family whose lives he had just ransacked and burned. The doors slid shut, sealing him inside. Madison sank to her knees right there on my hardwood floor, burying her face in her hands and sobbing loudly. Catherine and Thomas stood completely paralyzed. The invincible armor they had worn for decades had been stripped away entirely in less than 20 minutes. I had systematically dismantled their company, their son-in-law, and their carefully constructed golden child. I picked up my tablet and politely informed them that my security team would escort them out. I advised them to use the remaining time to pack their personal belongings from the Vanguard corporate office before my transition team changed the locks at midnight. They did not argue. They gathered the weeping Madison between them and retreated to the elevator in absolute, suffocating defeat. But a narcissistic mind does not simply accept defeat. It retreats. It recalculates. And then it mutates into something significantly more dangerous. 48 hours after I banished them from my penthouse, the retaliation began. I was sitting in my downtown corner office at Apex Holdings, reviewing the restructuring plans for the Vanguard commercial properties, when my head of public relations burst through the double glass doors without bothering to knock. He dropped a stack of printed articles and a tablet onto my desk, his face grim and drawn. I picked up the tablet. The headline from a prominent Chicago financial gossip blog screamed at me in bold red letters, "The Anonymous Billionaire Unmasked. Apex Holdings CEO suffers severe mental breakdown in hostile family takeover." I swiped to the next article, from a major local tabloid, "A family torn apart. Loving parents desperately seek help for erratic billionaire daughter." Catherine had gone to the press. Stripped of her company and her unearned wealth, she had resorted to the dirtiest, most vicious tactic available to a cornered narcissist. She was launching a full-scale, highly coordinated smear campaign designed to completely obliterate my public reputation. I read through the articles, my blood turning to ice water. Anonymous sources, undoubtedly my mother and father, had constructed a wildly fabricated narrative. They claimed my years of anonymity were not a deliberate strategic business maneuver, but a desperate attempt to conceal a severe, untreated mental illness. They told reporters that my acquisition of Vanguard Estates was not a calculated financial decision, but a manic, vindictive episode driven by delusion and paranoia. They portrayed themselves as terrified, unconditionally loving parents who had only ever tried to guide their sick daughter, only to be punished by her reckless billion-dollar spending spree. They did not stop with anonymous tabloid quotes. Catherine knew that to truly threaten my control over Apex Holdings, she needed legal leverage. She needed to legally convince the state of Illinois that I was entirely incapable of managing my own life and my vast financial empire. My public relations director handed me a heavy legal envelope that had just been served to our corporate reception desk. It was an emergency petition filed in the Cook County Probate Court. Catherine and Thomas were officially seeking a conservatorship over me. They were petitioning a judge to grant them immediate legal control over my personal autonomy, my medical decisions, and my entire financial portfolio. I opened the thick legal filing. Attached to the petition as Exhibit A were my private medical records from college. 12 years ago, when their relentless emotional abuse and impossible expectations had finally fractured me, I had sought treatment at the University Health Clinic for severe depression and anxiety. I had been prescribed medication. I had attended intensive therapy. It had been the darkest, most vulnerable period of my entire life, a direct and undeniable result of their toxic parenting. Now, Catherine had illegally unearthed those sensitive records and weaponized them. Her lawyers had twisted my past trauma into a fictitious present tense reality. The legal petition argued that my decision to cut off all contact with my family a decade ago was not a healthy boundary set by an abused child finding her footing, but the beginning of a prolonged and dangerous psychotic break. They claimed my intense focus on building Apex Holdings was a symptom of dangerous financial hoarding and manic grandiosity. They were employing the exact same legal framework that had famously trapped pop stars and vulnerable heirs. They were playing the role of weeping, desperate parents whose only wish was to save their sick daughter from destroying herself. Their goal was brutally clear. If a judge granted the emergency conservatorship, Catherine would immediately gain legal authority to sign documents on my behalf. She would reverse the Vanguard Estates acquisition, drain the liquid assets of Apex Holdings to pay off her own staggering debts, and have me locked away in some carefully selected luxury psychiatric facility where I could never threaten her social standing again. It was a breathtakingly evil strategy. They were attempting to steal my company by legally erasing my basic human rights. They thought that by exposing my deepest, most painful past vulnerabilities to the entire world, I would crumble under the intense public humiliation and surrender my empire simply to make the circus stop. They genuinely believed that the scared, depressed college student they had abandoned and discarded 12 years ago was still hiding somewhere inside me, waiting to be found. They were about to discover precisely how wrong they were. I walked out of my private office and moved directly down the hall toward the main glass-walled boardroom of Apex Holdings. I did not run. I did not rush. I moved with the measured, predatory grace of a CEO who was entirely, unshakably in control of her environment. Through the soundproof glass, I could already see my executive board assembled. These were 12 of the most ruthless, battle-tested financial minds in the Midwest, individuals who managed billions in institutional wealth and did not, under any circumstances, handle public scandals gracefully. The massive screens lining the boardroom walls were muted, but the blazing red chyrons of the financial news networks were unmistakable, reporting breathlessly on rumors of my supposed mental collapse. When I pushed open the heavy glass doors, the frantic murmuring ceased instantly. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like physical pressure against my chest. Victor Cole, my lead institutional investor and the unofficial chairman of the board, stood at the far end of the long mahogany table, looking grim and braced. He gestured toward a printed copy of the emergency conservatorship petition resting on the polished wood surface. "Sienna, we have a massive problem," Victor stated, skipping any pretense of formality. "Investor confidence is plummeting. Institutional backers are calling my personal phone every 5 minutes demanding answers. The Chicago tabloids are running wild with stories about your family, filing for legal control over your medical and financial decisions. They are openly claiming the Vanguard Estates acquisition was the direct result of a severe manic episode. We need you to explain exactly what is happening, and we need you to do it right now." A secondary board member, a conservative venture capitalist named Donovan, chimed in before I could even take my seat. "The optics on this are catastrophic. We manage vast sums of private wealth. Our clients demand absolute stability. If there is even a fraction of a percent of truth to these medical allegations, we have a fiduciary duty to protect this firm. I am putting forward a motion for you to take an immediate temporary leave of absence. We need to install an interim CEO until this highly damaging family dispute is fully resolved." A murmur of agreement rippled around the room. It was a textbook corporate mutiny. They were terrified of the negative press, and their immediate instinct was to amputate the perceived infected limb to save the larger corporate body. They wanted me to step down, surrender my power, and vanish into the shadows until the scandal subsided and memories faded. I walked to the head of the table. I did not sit down. I placed both hands flat on the mahogany surface and leaned forward, sweeping my gaze deliberately across the faces of the 12 men and women who had just attempted, however tentatively, to strip me of my empire. "Nobody is taking a leave of absence," I said, my voice resonating with terrifying, absolute calm. "And nobody is stepping down. If any of you genuinely believe I am suffering from a mental breakdown, you are vastly underestimating the woman who generated a 40% return on your initial investments last year." I picked up the remote and bypassed the news channel, switching the main boardroom screens to our secure internal financial dashboard. "Look at the screens," I commanded. "Do not look at the tabloids. Look at the raw data." The screens filled with complex financial models, real-time asset valuations, and projected quarterly earnings. I had spent the previous night running the exact numbers on the Vanguard restructuring. "Catherine and Thomas filed that absurd legal petition because they are completely destitute," I explained, slicing through their collective panic with cold, verifiable facts. "They leaked those stories to the press because I exposed their massive corporate fraud and removed them from power on national television. They are cornered animals lashing out at whatever they can reach. Now look at the projected revenue from the Vanguard commercial portfolio liquidation." I highlighted a specific column on the screen. "By aggressively restructuring their toxic debt and liquidating their underperforming vanity projects, Apex Holdings will absorb a net profit of $400 million within the next 90 days. That is not the frantic guesswork of an unstable mind. That is a perfectly executed, ruthlessly efficient corporate acquisition." The board members stared at the staggering profit projections. Color began to return to their faces as the raw mathematics completely obliterated the tabloid gossip that had consumed them minutes earlier. "Furthermore," I continued, reaching into my briefcase and tossing a stack of thick black folders down the length of the table, "I instructed my legal team to compile a comprehensive background report on my parents. Inside those folders you will find irrefutable proof that my mother and father have been systematically embezzling from a private trust fund for the better part of a decade. You will also find complete documentation of their son-in-law's theft of $2 million to cover illegal gambling debts." Victor opened the folder in front of him, his eyes scanning the damning financial records in silence. He looked up at me, the initial skepticism entirely displaced by something that looked very much like profound, genuine respect. "They filed for the conservatorship to stop you from exposing their own crimes," he said quietly, as if speaking the realization aloud for the first time. "Exactly," I replied. "They thought they could use my past vulnerability as a weapon against me. They believed that surfacing a depressive episode from my college years would spook my investors and force me into a settlement. They assumed I would cower in the face of a public relations nightmare." I stood up straight, projecting absolute, unshakable dominance over the room and everyone in it. "I want all of you to prepare yourselves. I am not settling. I am not hiding. I have secured the most formidable defense attorneys in the state of Illinois. We are going into closed chambers tomorrow morning, and I am going to legally execute that petition with extreme prejudice." I looked directly at Donovan, the man who had suggested I step down. "If anyone in this room lacks the stomach for a real fight, you are welcome to sell your shares back to the company today at current market value. But if you stand with me, I promise you that by tomorrow afternoon, the media narrative will completely flip, and Apex Holdings will emerge from this stronger, wealthier, and more feared than at any point in its history." The room was dead silent. I had not merely quelled a mutiny. I had completely rewired their understanding of my leadership, demonstrated that I was utterly impervious to emotional manipulation and external public pressure, and reminded them precisely why they had bet on me in the first place. Victor closed the black folder and pushed the emergency petition to the far edge of the table as though it were contaminated. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each board member in turn. No one moved to sell their shares. No one offered a single word of dissent. "We stand with you, Sienna," Victor declared, his voice firm and absolute. "Destroy them." I offered a single tight nod. The board was secured. The corporate fortress was locked down. Now it was time to step into the courtroom and spring the legal trap that would obliterate Catherine and Thomas forever. The heavy oak doors of the judge's private chambers closed behind us with a solid, echoing thud, sealing us inside the wood-paneled room. The air was instantly thick with tension, a stark and vivid contrast to the sterile, brightly lit corridors of the Cook County courthouse we had just navigated. This was not an open courtroom. It was an emergency closed-door hearing, a highly expedited process granted only under the most severe of circumstances, or, in this particular case, the most aggressively fabricated ones. Judge Iris Thorne, a seasoned jurist with silver hair and a reputation for absolute, unyielding pragmatism, sat behind a massive desk. She peered over her reading glasses, surveying the opposing forces gathered before her with the careful, practiced eye of someone who had seen every variety of human desperation that a courtroom could produce. On one side of the polished mahogany table sat my mother, Catherine, accompanied by my father, Thomas, and a team of high-priced probate attorneys they had undoubtedly retained on credit. Catherine had dressed for the occasion with calculated, almost clinical precision. The usual flashy designer logos and aggressive diamonds were gone. In their place, she wore a muted, conservative gray suit. Her makeup was deliberately subdued, carefully applied to emphasize the dark circles beneath her eyes. She looked fragile, exhausted, and perfectly cast in the role of a desperate, heartbroken matriarch fighting the only battle she had left, saving her sick, wayward child. On the opposite side of the table, I sat perfectly still, flanked by three of the most vicious, relentless corporate defense litigators in the city of Chicago. I wore a sharp, precisely tailored black suit, projecting nothing but absolute competence and icy, unassailable control. I did not look at my parents. I kept my gaze fixed steadily on Judge Thorne. The judge cleared her throat and opened the thick file resting on her desk. "We are here today to address an emergency petition for conservatorship filed by Catherine and Thomas Vanguard concerning their daughter, Sienna Vanguard," Judge Thorne stated, her voice dry and clinical. "The petitioners claim that the respondent is currently suffering from a severe, acute mental health crisis, rendering her entirely incapable of managing her personal affairs and her vast financial portfolio. Specifically, Apex Holdings." Judge Thorne looked directly at Catherine. "Mrs. Vanguard, this is an extreme legal measure. You are asking this court to completely strip an adult woman, a highly successful CEO, of her basic autonomy. I need to hear your reasoning, and it needs to be compelling." Catherine did not hesitate. She drew a slow, trembling breath, her hands quivering as she clasped them tightly on the table. It was the opening act of an Oscar-worthy performance. "Your Honor," Catherine began, her voice fracturing with perfectly calibrated emotion. "This is the hardest thing a mother could ever be forced to do. My husband and I are absolutely terrified for our daughter. 12 years ago, Sienna suffered a devastating depressive episode. She was hospitalized. She was medicated. We believed she had recovered, but she simply pushed us away and disappeared entirely into her work." A single, precisely timed tear escaped her eye, tracking a slow, deliberate path down her cheek. Thomas placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, executing his supporting role with practiced, quiet efficiency. "For a decade, we respected her boundaries," Catherine continued, her voice rising to a desperate, pleading pitch. "But over the last 48 hours, she has completely unraveled. The hostile takeover of our family business, Vanguard Estates, was not a rational financial decision. It was a manic, vindictive attack. She is destroying our legacy, but more importantly, she is destroying herself. She is erratic. She is paranoid. She is making billion-dollar decisions driven by a sick, delusional vendetta. We are begging you, Your Honor. Please give us the authority to step in and get our little girl the medical help she so desperately needs before she loses absolutely everything. Catherine lowered her head, weeping softly into a folded tissue. Her attorneys nodded with choreographed sympathy, presenting the 12-year-old medical records to the judge as though they were current, indisputable, and irrefutable proof of my incapacity. The performance was sickeningly effective. If I had not been the intended target of every fabricated word, I might, under different circumstances, have almost believed the desperate mother narrative she was so skillfully spinning. Judge Thorne looked troubled, her expression carefully neutral in the way of someone who takes their office seriously enough not to reveal a verdict prematurely. She reviewed the old medical files, then turned her sharp, searching gaze toward my legal team. "Counsel," Judge Thorne said, her tone measured but cautious, "the petitioners have presented a narrative of severe, escalating instability. How does the respondent answer these incredibly serious allegations?" My lead attorney, a razor-sharp litigator named Evelyn Vance, rose from her chair with unhurried confidence. She did not raise her voice. She did not offer a passionate or emotional defense. She simply picked up a sleek silver laptop and placed it directly in front of the judge. "Your Honor," Evelyn said, her voice smooth and deadly in equal measure. "The petitioners have spun a very compelling, highly emotional piece of fiction today. They rely heavily on medical records that are over a decade old, while conveniently ignoring the respondent's flawless, remarkably successful 10-year track record as the CEO of Apex Holdings. However, we do not need to argue about the distant past. We have absolute, irrefutable proof of the petitioner's true motives and of their own profoundly vicious mental state. Recorded less than 72 hours ago." Evelyn tapped the keyboard. "Your Honor, I present Exhibit A, the security footage and unedited audio recording from the private dining room at Liel Restaurant, legally subpoenaed by our team yesterday afternoon." The video flared to life on the screen. The high-definition camera had captured the entire scene with perfect, unforgiving clarity. It showed the luxurious private room, the 12 occupied chairs, and me standing quietly near the door. The audio, enhanced and crystal clear, filled the judge's chambers like a cold wind. The recording played my mother's voice, cruel and mocking, completely stripped of the fragile victim persona she was currently performing for the court. "You have always insisted on doing things your own mediocre way, Sienna. You refused to join Vanguard Estates. You refused to marry a man of proper standing. You chose this difficult, unrewarding path for yourself. So just sit on the floor, darling. The floor suits you perfectly." The video clearly captured Madison and Andre erupting into cruel, satisfied laughter, validating and amplifying the abuse. It showed Catherine smirking, her eyes filled with malicious, triumphant glee. And then the recording showed my response. I did not yell. I did not cry. I calmly placed a velvet box on the table, offered a polite, icy smile, and walked out of the room with complete and unimpeachable dignity. Judge Thorne stared at the screen, her expression hardening visibly with every second that passed. The contrast between the weeping, concerned mother currently sitting in her chambers and the vicious, arrogant bully on the video was not merely striking, it was staggering. Evelyn paused the recording. "As you can clearly see, Your Honor, my client is not suffering from a manic episode. She is exhibiting extraordinary restraint in the face of targeted, sustained psychological abuse carried out by the very people who now claim to be terrified for her well-being. The acquisition of Vanguard Estates was not a psychotic break. It was a perfectly executed, entirely rational response to a hostile family dynamic and an exceptionally profitable business maneuver. The petitioners are not attempting to save my client. They are attempting to steal her company because she legally outsmarted them. The silence in the judge's chambers was absolute and deafening. The trap had snapped shut with lethal, irreversible precision. Catherine's artificial tears had dried completely, her face draining to a sickly, mottled white. Thomas stared at the paused video image as though the floor had dropped out from beneath him. Their expensive attorneys shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the full and catastrophic dimensions of the situation they had been blindly dragged into finally registering on their professional faces. Evelyn did not pause to allow my parents a single moment of recovery. She moved with the lethal efficiency of a seasoned litigator who understood, with complete certainty, that she had the opposition entirely cornered. The video evidence had thoroughly dismantled Catherine's carefully constructed narrative of maternal concern. But Evelyn was not finished. She was preparing to deliver the final crushing blow that would permanently neutralize every threat my family had ever posed, or could ever pose again, to my empire. "Your Honor?" Evelyn continued, her voice remaining perfectly, almost eerily level. "The footage clearly establishes my client's absolute mental acuity and the petitioner's profound malicious intent. However, to fully understand the desperation driving this fraudulent conservatorship petition, we must examine the financial reality the petitioners are so desperately attempting to conceal." She reached into her leather briefcase and extracted a thick, heavily bound dossier, identical to the one I had presented in the penthouse 2 days prior. She placed it on Judge Thorne's desk with a resounding, deliberate thud. "During the standard due diligence process leading up to the acquisition of Vanguard Estates," Evelyn explained, "my client's forensic accounting team uncovered severe financial irregularities. While investigating the staggering corporate debt accumulated under the petitioner's leadership, the auditors traced a series of unauthorized, deliberately obfuscated capital injections used to artificially inflate Vanguard's failing operational accounts." Judge Thorne leaned forward, her brow furrowing as she opened the dossier. The atmosphere in the chambers shifted from tense to something altogether more electrified and dangerous. Catherine's face shed all remaining color, transforming into a mask of pure, undisguised terror. Thomas gripped the edge of the mahogany table so tightly his knuckles turned white, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy oak doors as if calculating the precise geometry of an escape route. Their attorneys, realizing the full magnitude of the situation into which their clients had blindly led them, sat perfectly, rigidly still, radiating the particular species of professional panic that comes with the sudden awareness that one has been catastrophically deceived. Evelyn did not miss a single beat. The auditors discovered that these capital injections were not generated by legitimate business operations or secured loans, she continued, her voice crisp and entirely unforgiving. They were systematically funneled from a private offshore trust account, a trust account established 12 years ago by the late Arthur Vanguard, Sienna's paternal grandfather. I watched my father flinch at the mention of his own father's name. Arthur Vanguard had been a shrewd, pragmatic businessman who had built the foundation of the family's wealth with patience and discipline, long before Catherine's vanity spending had begun its slow, relentless work of erosion. He had always possessed an uncanny ability to see straight through my mother's superficial facade, recognizing with quiet, unflinching clarity the toxic dynamic she so deliberately cultivated within our family. When he passed away, he had attempted to protect me, establishing an irrevocable trust designed to secure my future entirely independent of my parents' control and reach. He had explicitly instructed his attorneys to keep the very existence of that trust hidden from Catherine until I reached the age of 25. Unfortunately, my grandfather had severely, fatally underestimated my mother's ruthlessness and my father's craven complicity. When I suffered my depressive episode during college, effectively vanishing from their lives to protect what remained of my own sanity, they seized the opportunity without a moment of hesitation. They used the exact same medical records they had presented to the court today to convince the original trustees that I was entirely incapacitated and wholly incapable of managing my own inheritance. They manipulated the legal framework with practiced precision, installed themselves as the primary financial stewards of the trust, and subsequently treated it as their own personal slush fund for the better part of a decade. Your Honor, Evelyn stated, her tone sharpening to a lethal edge, the dossier before you contains irrefutable proof that for the past 10 years, Catherine and Thomas Vanguard have systematically embezzled over $40 million from Sienna Vanguard's private trust. The number echoed through the small chambers like a detonation, a staggering, almost incomprehensible figure that crystallized, with brutal and unambiguous clarity, the absolute depravity of my parents' actions. They hadn't merely abandoned me. They had actively, deliberately stolen my future to fund their own reckless and boundless extravagance. Evelyn pointed to a specific tabbed section within the dossier. The financial tracing is absolute, she continued. The stolen funds were not solely used to prop up the failing Vanguard estates. Millions of dollars were diverted to sustain the luxurious lifestyle of their younger daughter, Madison, including the direct purchase of her $3 million Gold Coast residence. Furthermore, significant portions of Sienna's inheritance were utilized to pay exorbitant legal retainers to Andre, Madison's husband, effectively funneling stolen wealth directly into his corporate law firm under the guise of legitimate professional fees. I watched my parents as the full, crushing weight of their crimes was methodically laid bare before the judge. The realization was finally sinking into them, slowly, sickeningly, that their entire gilded existence, the mansion, the luxury cars, the country club memberships, Madison's designer wardrobe, Andre's smug superiority and carefully cultivated air of success had been entirely subsidized by the daughter they had relentlessly mocked, dismissed, and discarded. They had spent a full decade believing themselves superior in every conceivable way, all while secretly, ravenously feeding off the wealth my grandfather had specifically and lovingly intended for me. The emergency conservatorship petition filed before this court today is not an act of parental love, Evelyn concluded, her voice ringing with absolute, unshakable certainty. It is a desperate, calculated attempt by the petitioners to regain control over the primary victim of their own massive financial fraud. By obtaining legal authority over my client, they intended to instantly reverse the Vanguard acquisition, bury the mounting evidence of their embezzlement, and permanently silence the only person on earth capable of holding them fully accountable for what they have done. Judge Thorne closed the dossier slowly, deliberately. She removed her reading glasses and placed them on the desk with quiet, measured finality. The expression on her face was one of profound, chilling outrage. The controlled fury of a woman who had dedicated her career to the law and had just witnessed it weaponized against an innocent person with breathtaking cynicism. She looked at Catherine and Thomas, her eyes narrowing with undisguised contempt. The silence in the chambers was absolute, heavy with the terrifying, imminent reality of the legal reckoning that was about to descend upon them. Mrs. Vanguard, Mr. Vanguard, Judge Thorne began, her voice dangerously low and resonant with barely restrained authority. In my 20 years on the bench, I have presided over complex family disputes, bitter divorces, and contentious probate hearings involving the full spectrum of human greed and dysfunction. However, the level of calculated malice, breathtaking fraud, and absolute wanton disregard for your own daughter's well-being presented in this chamber today is entirely unprecedented in my experience." The judge paused, letting her condemnation hang in the air of the small room, ensuring every syllable landed with maximum, irreversible impact. Catherine opened her mouth, a desperate, tearful defense already forming on her lips. But Judge Thorne immediately raised one hand, silencing her with absolute, unquestionable authority. "Do not speak," the judge commanded, her voice cracking through the room like a whip. "You have already said more than enough today. The evidence before me is unequivocal and overwhelming. This court will not be weaponized to facilitate a criminal conspiracy, nor will it tolerate the blatant manipulation of the judicial system to silence a victim of profound, sustained financial abuse." The trap had closed completely and irrevocably. There was no escape, no room for negotiation, and absolutely no mercy remaining for the family that had offered me the floor. The execution was complete. Now the sentencing would begin. Judge Thorne did not lower her voice. She leaned forward, her heavy wooden gavel resting within reach, a physical, unmistakable symbol of the absolute ruin she was about to rain down. "The emergency petition for conservatorship is hereby dismissed with prejudice," Judge Thorne declared, her words striking the quiet room like physical blows delivered one after another. "This means you are permanently barred from ever bringing this fraudulent, malicious claim before this or any other court in the state of Illinois again. You attempted to misuse the judicial system to enslave your own daughter and cover up a multi-million-dollar theft spanning an entire decade. I will not allow my courtroom to serve as the final stage for your relentless, years-long campaign of abuse." Catherine released a sob, a loud, ugly, desperate sound that garnered absolutely zero sympathy from a single person present. Thomas stared blankly ahead, his breathing shallow and rapid, as though his body was only dimly aware it still needed oxygen. "Furthermore," Judge Thorne continued, her tone growing colder still, "if such a thing was possible, I am not simply dismissing this case and sending you home. As an officer of the court, I am legally and ethically obligated to report profound financial crimes when irrefutable evidence is placed before me. I am ordering my clerk to make an official certified copy of the dossier provided by the respondent's legal team. I am personally forwarding this entire file to the Cook County District Attorney and the White Collar Crime Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The color drained completely from my father's face. He understood, with the visceral, bone-deep certainty of a man who had helped orchestrate the crime, exactly what federal involvement meant. It meant prison. "In addition," the judge stated, "to ensure that restitution remains possible for the victim of this staggering embezzlement, I am issuing an immediate emergency freeze on all personal bank accounts, offshore holdings, and physical assets currently registered to Catherine and Thomas Vanguard. You are ordered to repay the stolen trust funds in their entirety. Given the magnitude and duration of the theft, you are effectively bankrupt as of this exact moment." She looked at them both with the flat, impassive finality of someone closing a door forever. "You are dismissed." Evelyn closed her laptop with a sharp, deeply satisfying click. I stood up carefully, smoothing the front of my sharp black suit. I did not look at my parents as they were practically scraped off their chairs by their terrified, deflated attorneys. They had walked into this courthouse expecting to strip me of my fundamental human rights and walk out with my multi-billion-dollar empire tucked under their arms. Instead, they were leaving with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the absolute certainty of imminent federal indictments bearing their names. They were penniless. They were utterly, permanently destroyed. I walked out of the courthouse and stepped into the bright Chicago afternoon. I drew a deep, slow breath of crisp autumn air. The heavy, suffocating chain that had bound me to their toxic expectations and relentless emotional abuse was finally, permanently Severed. I was free. But a dying parasite does not simply release its host without one final desperate thrashing attempt at survival. While my parents were busy consulting criminal defense attorneys they could no longer afford, the shockwaves of my financial execution were tearing through the rest of the family at speed. Across the city, inside a sprawling $3 million Gold Coast mansion, my sister Madison was experiencing her own personal apocalypse. The carefully constructed, heavily filtered illusion of her perfect life had been utterly, irrevocably annihilated. Her husband Andre had fled the state within hours of signing the divorce papers, leaving behind a mountain of illegal gambling debts and the shredded remains of a once prestigious legal career. The bank, alerted to the frozen Vanguard accounts and the active federal fraud investigation, had immediately initiated aggressive foreclosure proceedings on her home. The mansion, purchased directly with the very trust funds my parents had stolen from me, was no longer hers. It had never truly been. Madison sat on the floor of her massive, custom-built walk-in closet. Designer gowns, imported handbags, and imported shoes lay scattered everywhere in a chaotic, desperate sprawl. She was frantically trying to pack her most valuable possessions into designer luggage before bank agents arrived to physically seize the property. She was drinking expensive champagne straight from the bottle, her hands shaking violently, her perfect makeup smeared and ruined by what appeared to be hours of uninterrupted hysterical crying. She was completely broke. Her black credit cards were declining at every transaction. Her wealthy socialite friends, the exact same women who had eagerly, gratuitously laughed at my expense during my birthday dinner, were actively ignoring her increasingly desperate calls. In the ruthless, unforgiving hierarchy of Chicago high society, a looming federal fraud scandal and a sudden, catastrophic plunge into poverty made you instantaneously, irrevocably toxic. She was a complete social pariah, and the city had already moved on without her. But Madison did not possess the capacity for genuine self-reflection. She did not blame her mother for stealing my inheritance. She did not blame her husband for embezzling company funds to cover his addiction. Her narcissistic mind, carefully molded by decades of being the untouchable golden child, the one who could do no wrong, directed every ounce of its considerable venom entirely and exclusively toward me. She firmly and completely believed that I was the villain who had unjustly stolen her rightful throne and deliberately, maliciously dismantled her flawless existence. She gripped the empty champagne bottle tightly, her knuckles turning stark white against the glass. She refused to accept that she was destined to become a regular, working-class citizen navigating a world that would not accommodate her entitlement. She refused to sit on the floor of her ruined life while I stood in the penthouse of the empire I had built. She needed a way to force my hand, to create a spectacle so massive, so viscerally public, so undeniably damaging that I would have no choice but to pay her off, simply to make it disappear. Madison dropped the bottle and grabbed her phone, her thumbs flying furiously across the screen as she searched the local Chicago Society news pages. She knew I could not be touched in a boardroom or a courtroom. I was too insulated, too completely protected by my elite security team and my vicious legal counsel. But she also understood that a billionaire CEO could not hide in the shadows indefinitely. I had a public image to maintain now. The anonymous era was over. She found exactly what she was looking for on the front page of a prominent philanthropic website. A massive, glittering banner advertisement announcing the upcoming Apex Holdings Charity Gala. An exclusive, highly publicized event hosted by Siena Vanguard at the Field Museum. The gala was the premier social event of the entire season, guaranteed to be attended by international press, elite investors, and the city's most powerful political figures, all in a single breathtaking room. A dark, calculating smile spread slowly across Madison's tear-stained face. It was the perfect target. She was going to infiltrate the gala. She was going to wait until the cameras were rolling and the world was watching. And then she was going to crash the stage and unleash a performance that would destroy my carefully cultivated reputation forever. She was going to make me pay for ruining her life, no matter the personal cost of the attempt. Exactly 1 month later, the freezing Chicago winds had given way to a crisp, crystalline winter evening. The historic stone facade of the Field Museum of Natural History was brilliantly illuminated by towering beams of icy blue and pure white light. A flawless red carpet stretched down the grand, sweeping front steps, flanked by velvet ropes and a small, disciplined army of heavily vetted private security personnel. Tonight was the inaugural Apex Holdings Philanthropic Gala, and it was no longer merely a corporate event. It had become the definitive, undisputed social pinnacle of the entire Chicago season. Every billionaire, elite politician, and media executive in the Midwest had fiercely lobbied for one of the coveted invitations to this exclusive gathering. The guest list was a masterclass in concentrated power and influence, and I was its absolute, undisputed center. My convoy of matte black armored SUVs glided to a smooth halt at the base of the museum steps. My security director opened my door and offered his hand. I stepped out into an explosion of hundreds of camera lenses firing simultaneously. The roar of the assembled press corps was deafening. I was not wearing an unbranded practical blazer tonight. I wore a breathtaking, custom-designed emerald green gown that swept gracefully across the red carpet. A masterpiece of high fashion dripping with subtle, staggering wealth and absolute, unquestionable authority. My hair was swept up into an elegant, precise style, and a simple but blindingly expensive diamond necklace rested against my collarbone. I did not look like a woman who had recently survived a vicious, multi-front family coup. I looked like a woman who had successfully conquered an entire city and was now graciously allowing everyone else to merely exist within the boundaries of the empire she had built. Reporters strained against the velvet ropes, thrusting microphones forward in a frantic, overlapping chorus. "Sienna, over here. How does it feel to be named the most influential CEO of the year? Can you comment on the 40% surge in Vanguard Estates' profitability since your acquisition? What inspired your $50 million donation to the Chicago Youth Mental Health Initiative tonight?" I paused near the center of the carpet and turned to face the flashing cameras. I offered them a warm, perfectly calibrated, utterly confident smile. The exact expression of a seasoned, untouchable titan of industry who has nothing left to prove and everything left to accomplish. I stepped toward the nearest prominent financial journalist, a woman who had written a glowing editorial about my methodical dismantling of the fraudulent conservatorship petition. "Thank you," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the chaotic energy of the press line. Tonight is not about corporate acquisitions or past legal victories. Tonight is entirely about giving back to the city that has allowed Apex Holdings to thrive so spectacularly. We are here to ensure that vulnerable individuals have the absolute best resources available to protect their mental health and secure their own independent futures, on their own terms. The reporters scribbled furiously, captivated. They did not see me as the pathetic, troubled daughter my mother had so desperately tried to paint for the world. They saw a brilliant, resilient, unstoppable philanthropic force. They saw a woman who had faced a massive, highly publicized betrayal at the hands of her own blood and had emerged from the ashes stronger, wealthier, and more universally respected than ever before. I gracefully excused myself from the press line and ascended the grand stairs of the museum. Gloved attendants pulled the heavy glass doors open, ushering me into the breathtaking main exhibition hall. The towering skeleton of the famous Tyrannosaurus Rex presided over the space as the dramatic centerpiece, surrounded by dozens of elegantly decorated banquet tables. Crystal glassware sparkled under warm ambient lighting. A renowned string quartet played softly from a raised balcony, providing a sophisticated and entirely fitting soundtrack to the evening. Waiters in pristine tuxedos circulated through the rapidly filling room, bearing silver trays of expensive champagne and exquisite hors d'oeuvres. As I crossed the polished marble floor, the most powerful people in Chicago parted instinctively to let me pass. Mayors, senators, and rival hedge fund managers all offered nods of profound, genuine respect. I was no longer an anonymous ghost manipulating markets from a hidden penthouse. I was the undisputed queen of the board, visible, powerful, and utterly unassailable. The transition had been brutal in its intensity, but deeply, viscerally validating. In the 4 weeks since the closed-door hearing, my life had accelerated at a dizzying, relentless pace. My elite restructuring team had entirely purged the Vanguard Estates corporate offices, firing every useless, overpaid executive my parents had installed as a matter of nepotism and blind loyalty. We renegotiated the toxic loan portfolio, liquidated the failing vanity projects, and stabilized the core real estate assets. The market responded with overwhelming, immediate enthusiasm. My parents, meanwhile, had vanished into complete obscurity. Stripped of their stolen wealth and facing imminent, highly severe federal indictments for their decade-long trust fund embezzlement, they had been forced to vacate their sprawling suburban estate. They were hiding in a modest rented apartment somewhere on the periphery of the city, reportedly terrified to show their faces in any public forum. Their former high society friends had abandoned them with breathtaking speed, treating their impending criminal charges like a highly contagious disease no amount of sympathy or history could justify risking proximity to. They were bankrupt. They were disgraced. They were completely, irrevocably powerless. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and took a slow, deeply satisfying sip. I surveyed the glittering room, taking in the absolute, meticulous perfection of the event I had orchestrated. This gala was my ultimate victory lap, a flawless, undeniable physical manifestation of my total triumph over the people who had devoted years of energy and ingenuity to destroying me. I felt entirely, unshakably secure. My security team, the best in the business, monitored every entrance and exit with military-grade precision. The guest list had been vetted and cross-referenced 3 separate times to ensure absolutely no unwanted individuals could breach the perimeter. I was surrounded by allies, investors, and admirers. There was nothing that could interrupt this perfect, triumphant evening. I took another slow sip of champagne, completely at ease, completely ready for whatever the night held. While I stood bathed in the warm amber glow of the museum chandeliers, an entirely different scene was unfolding in the freezing service alley behind the building. Catherine, Thomas, and Madison huddled behind a row of industrial dumpsters, shivering violently against the biting Chicago wind. They were completely, almost pitifully unrecognizable from the arrogant, untouchable family that had mocked me at Liel just 1 month ago. Catherine wore an outdated evening gown pulled from the back of whatever remained of her wardrobe. Her normally immaculate hair was flattened by the harsh wind, and the frantic, hollow look in her eyes betrayed the absolute desperation consuming her from the inside out. Thomas looked like a broken, hollowed-out old man, his tuxedo hanging loosely on his rapidly shrinking frame. He kept checking his phone with trembling hands, terrified that the next incoming call would be a federal agent executing their arrest warrant. Madison stood between them, her teeth chattering audibly in the cold. She clutched a crumpled, counterfeit VIP lanyard in her trembling hands. Her mansion was gone. Her husband had abandoned her and the country. Her credit cards were declined everywhere she tried to use them. She had absolutely nothing left except a burning, obsessive, consuming hatred for the sister who had dismantled her unearned luxury piece by careful piece. They were out of options. The federal indictments loomed over all three of them like a guillotine suspended by a thread. Their former friends refused to answer their desperate calls. They were staring down total financial ruin and the very real prospect of federal prison time. This charity gala, crashing it, disrupting it, weaponizing it against me, was their absolute last resort. A chaotic, extraordinarily high-risk gamble born entirely of pure, cornered desperation. Catherine had meticulously planned the infiltration using the last shreds of social capital she could leverage. 2 days prior, she had tracked down a mid-level catering manager who had once serviced the Vanguard Estate's corporate holiday parties. Through a combination of emotional manipulation and a desperate cash bribe, she had secured 3 counterfeit vendor passes designed to grant them access through the museum's underground loading dock. Catherine grabbed Madison by the shoulders. She pulled her close, her voice dropping to a frantic, urgent whisper. "Listen to me very carefully, Madison. We only get one shot at this. One window. And it will not come again. You have to be absolutely perfect tonight. You are the victim. You are the heartbroken, destitute sister who has been cruelly cast out into the freezing streets by a greedy, sociopathic billionaire. When we get inside, you keep your head down and stay in the shadows until she takes the stage. Do you understand me?" Madison nodded, her eyes wide and manic with a combination of terror and desperate resolve. She rehearsed her fake tears, practicing the precise, calculated expression of profound tragedy she planned to broadcast to the entire watching world. Thomas rubbed his freezing hands together, his voice trembling with raw, undisguised terror. "Catherine, if we get caught doing this, the judge will revoke our bail agreements immediately. We could be arrested right here on the museum steps in front of everyone." Catherine shot him a look of absolute, withering venom. "We are already going to prison, Thomas. Unless we force her hand tonight, our lives are completely and permanently over." She turned back to face the steel doors. "Now move." Their strategy relied entirely upon the unpredictable, volatile power of public opinion, mass emotion, and the moment's singular shock value. They knew the Apex Holdings philanthropic gala was being live-streamed globally to millions of investors, charity organizations, and financial news outlets. They understood I had meticulously cultivated a pristine, untouchable public image over the preceding 4 weeks. Catherine firmly believed that if Madison stormed the main stage during the highly anticipated keynote address, the sheer visceral shock of the intrusion would momentarily paralyze my security team, providing just enough of a window. Madison would violently seize the microphone and unleash a perfectly scripted, hysterical performance. She would publicly accuse me of destroying our family out of pure, unprovoked spite. She would claim I had illegally seized Vanguard Estates and driven my own loving, innocent parents into abject poverty. Catherine's twisted logic dictated that the wealthy, image-conscious donors in the audience would instantly recoil and turn against me. She calculated that the brutal public pressure, combined with the catastrophic risk of a viral public relations nightmare of unprecedented scale, would force me to surrender on live television. She genuinely believed I would publicly agree to a massive financial settlement and drop the criminal embezzlement charges just to silence the screaming, sobbing sister kneeling on my stage and preserve my corporate reputation. It was the ultimate desperate gambit of a narcissist who still sincerely believed she could control any narrative through sheer emotional terrorism. Catherine checked her watch, noting the exact time the keynote was scheduled to begin. She signaled to Thomas and Madison, and the 3 disgraced family members crept out from behind the dumpsters. They approached the heavy steel doors of the underground service entrance. 2 massive private security guards stood at the checkpoint, scanning vendor badges with digital readers. Catherine held her breath, her heart hammering a frantic, irregular rhythm against her ribs. She handed the counterfeit passes to the guard. The scanner emitted a sharp mechanical beep that seemed to echo in the concrete tunnel. The light flashed green. The catering manager's bypass had held. The guard waved them through without a second glance. Completely, fatally unaware that he had just allowed the single greatest immediate threat to my empire directly into the building. The trio slipped into the sprawling labyrinth of service corridors beneath the museum. They navigated the network of stainless steel kitchens and busy catering staff, keeping their faces turned down behind oversized catering trays. They quietly ascended a service stairwell and slipped through a discreet side door, stepping directly into the deep shadows of the massive main exhibition hall. The glittering elite crowd was entirely oblivious to their presence. Madison concealed herself behind a towering marble column, her eyes scanning the room until they found me. I was standing near the front of the stage, glowing under the crystal chandeliers, surrounded by a constellation of admiring investors and powerful donors. A wave of pure, toxic jealousy boiled over in Madison's chest. She tightened her grip on the outdated fabric of her dress. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the podium and tapped the microphone, signaling the start of the keynote presentation. The countdown had officially begun. Madison took a deep, shuddering breath, coiling herself like a spring, completely, maniacally ready to sprint out of the darkness and annihilate my perfect evening. The master of ceremonies leaned into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my absolute honor to introduce the founder and CEO of Apex Holdings, a woman whose vision is actively reshaping the city of Chicago. Please welcome Sienna." The applause was deafening. It rolled through the great hall like deep, rolling thunder, vibrating against the polished marble floors and reverberating off the ancient stone walls. I stepped out from the wings and walked toward the stage. The warmth of the spotlight hit my face, but it was the genuine, earned respect radiating from the audience that truly illuminated the moment. I approached the sleek acrylic podium and looked out over the assembled sea of Chicago's most powerful citizens. I raised my hand slightly to quiet the roaring crowd. "Thank you," I began, my voice projecting with steady, unforced authority. "Tonight represents more than just a philanthropic milestone. It represents the active, deliberate breaking of generational cycles. It is about providing a genuine lifeline to those who have been manipulated and discarded by the very people who were supposed to protect them above all others." I was preparing to transition to the specific funding initiatives when a sudden commotion erupted near the left side of the stage. A figure burst from the shadows. It was Madison. She shoved an usher aside with surprising, desperate strength and sprinted up the stairs. The hem of her dress caught on the railing and tore sharply, but she did not slow down. The audience released a collective gasp as she rushed across the stage floor toward the secondary microphone. Before my security detail could intercept her, she lunged for the stand and ripped the microphone from its cradle. "Do not listen to her," Madison screamed, her voice shrieking and echoing through the museum hall. "She is a monster. She is a sociopath. She is a liar standing at that podium pretending to care about vulnerable people while she destroys her own family." My security director was already sprinting across the stage toward her. I raised my right hand. "Stop. Let her speak." The security team froze instantly, establishing a tight perimeter but yielding Madison the center stage. I stepped back from my own podium and projected absolute, chilling calm. I folded my hands in front of me and waited. Madison panted heavily, clutching the microphone with white knuckles. She looked out at the sea of stunned, silent billionaires and forced a sob, squeezing her eyes shut to manufacture the tears she needed. "This woman, this supposed philanthropist, is my sister," Madison cried, her voice cracking with manufactured agony on each carefully selected word. "She stands up here tonight talking about helping vulnerable people, but she just destroyed her own flesh and blood. She stole our family company. She threw our loving elderly parents out into the freezing streets. Because of her vindictive jealousy, I have lost my home. My husband was driven away and had to flee. We have absolutely nothing left." Madison dropped to her knees on the stage, clutching her chest in an extraordinary display of melodramatic suffering. She took everything from us, everything, just to feed her sick ego. How can you give this woman your money? How can you applaud someone who leaves her own family completely destitute? The vast hall fell into dead, suspended silence. The crowd shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few wealthy socialites whispered urgently behind their hands, casting uneasy glances in my direction. The reporters gathered at the back of the room were already typing rapidly on their phones, sensing a potentially scandalous and deeply viral moment taking shape in real time. Madison looked up at me through her disheveled hair, and for just a fraction of a second, a triumphant, deeply malicious smirk flashed across her face. She genuinely believed she had won. She thought she had successfully weaponized my own charity gala against me, turned my moment of public triumph into the instrument of my public humiliation. She expected panic. She expected me to frantically call additional security or to mount a desperate emotional self-defense in front of the cameras. I did none of those things. I simply looked down at her kneeling on the polished stage floor, and I smiled. It was the same cold, quiet, lethal smile I had offered her mother exactly 1 month before. "Are you quite finished, Madison?" I asked, my voice carrying with perfect clarity through my lapel microphone. "Because if your performance is over, I have a brief video presentation I would love to share with the audience." Madison faltered. Her manufactured sobs hitched awkwardly in her throat. She looked genuinely confused, completely thrown off balance by my total, unrattled absence of panic. I lifted my gaze over the heads of the audience and locked eyes with my technical director in the AV booth at the rear of the hall. I gave a single, precise nod. The brilliant stage lights dimmed instantly. The massive high-definition LED screens positioned behind us went completely, abruptly black. Then a loud, resonant electronic chime filled the sound system, and the screens flared to life, switching directly to a live feed from a national news network. A bright red banner strobed across the bottom of the displays. "Breaking news: Federal indictments unsealed." The anchor's voice was pumped through the museum's entire sound system, drowning out even the sound of Madison's panicked breathing. "We are interrupting our broadcast with a rapidly developing story. The Department of Justice has just unsealed federal indictments against the former executive board of Vanguard Estates. Arrest warrants are being executed for Catherine and Thomas Vanguard, along with corporate attorney Andre. The charges include wire fraud, aggressive tax evasion, and the systematic embezzlement of $40 million from a private trust fund. The FBI has confirmed that Andre was apprehended less than 1 hour ago while attempting to board an international flight out of O'Hare." The charity gala erupted. The wealthy investors around the room gasped audibly, turning to one another with wide eyes. Journalists abandoned their previous angle entirely, raising cameras and phones to capture what was rapidly becoming something far more significant and far more damaging than a disrupted keynote speech. The whispers of doubt that Madison had planted in the room moments before instantly transformed into loud, undisguised expressions of disgust, directed entirely and unanimously at her. Madison remained kneeling on the stage floor. She turned her head slowly, involuntarily, to look at the massive LED screens towering behind her. She watched live news footage of federal agents raiding a modest apartment building somewhere on the city's outskirts. She saw the graphic awe, her mother's face, her father's face, her husband's face, with the single word "indicted" stamped across each in bold, unambiguous red letters. The microphone slipped from her trembling fingers and hit the polished stage floor with a sharp, screeching electronic crack. The manufactured tears on her cheeks were immediately and involuntarily replaced by something altogether different and entirely genuine: raw, undisguised terror. She finally understood. with the sickening clarity of someone watching a carefully constructed world collapse in real time, that I had not merely survived her family's assault. I had orchestrated a far larger, far more comprehensive, and utterly inescapable public reckoning that she could never walk back, appeal, or outrun. The massive LED screen shifted again, cutting without warning to live aerial footage from O'Hare International Airport. A news helicopter hovered above the dark tarmac, its camera zooming in tightly on a frantic, stumbling figure surrounded by a constellation of flashing blue and red police lights. It was Andre, violently pinned against the hood of an unmarked black sedan by heavily armed federal agents, his expensive luggage scattered and burst open across the wet concrete behind him. He had attempted to flee the country with whatever stolen funds he could quickly liquidate, but my private security contractors had tipped off federal authorities hours before the gala had even begun. The arrogant golden couple was now a spectacular, nationally televised, real-time tragedy. The wealthy donors and influential politicians filling the Great Hall turned their collective, disgusted gaze back to Madison. The elite social world she had so slavishly worshipped her entire life was actively watching her family burn, and they were standing, without hesitation, on my side. Before Madison could attempt to formulate another desperate lie, the heavy oak doors at the rear of the Grand Exhibition Hall swung open with a resounding theatrical crash. Two tight formations of stern, purposeful men and women wearing dark windbreakers with prominent FBI lettering strode into the ballroom, moving with absolute and terrifying certainty. The high society crowd parted instantly, instinctively. Sandwiched between the agents, struggling weakly against the tight steel handcuffs binding their wrists, were Catherine and Thomas. They had been intercepted at the service entrance, pulled out from the shadows of the loading corridor they had used to enter, and marched directly into the blazing light and full, unobstructed public view of the main hall. My mother looked entirely feral. Her outdated evening gown was torn and snagged from her time, crouched behind industrial dumpsters in the freezing cold. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure animal panic. My father simply wept, a broken man who had finally, completely exhausted every resource that was never rightfully his. The federal agents marched them straight down the center aisle of the hall, parading them past the very billionaires, society figures, and media executives my mother had spent her entire adult life striving to impress, to belong among, to be envied by. The humiliation was total, and it was permanent. They reached the base of the stage. The lead federal agent looked up at me and offered a brief professional nod before turning his attention to the woman struggling and twisting in his custody. Catherine thrashed against the agent's grip, her eyes locking onto mine with an expression of pure, desperate, fraying terror. She reached instinctively for her classic manipulation tactic, pitching her voice to the familiar register of the victimized, bewildered mother. "Sienna, please," Catherine begged, her voice cracking as camera flashes fired relentlessly around her. "You have to stop this. Tell them it is a terrible misunderstanding. We are family. You cannot let them take us away like this. Not in front of all these people. Please." I stepped to the edge of the stage and looked down at the ruined woman who had spent decades actively trying to dismantle my spirit, my confidence, and my future. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I felt nothing but the pristine, clarifying weight of absolute justice, the kind that takes years to arrive, but, when it does, lands with the force of everything that preceded it. I leaned slightly into my lapel microphone, ensuring my final words to her would echo through the entire museum and be captured by every news outlet present. "Family builds each other up," I stated, my voice carrying across the hall like a blade dropping onto marble. "Parasites drain their hosts until there is nothing left. You made your choice when you stole my future to fund your vanity and your extravagance. I am simply ensuring you finally pay the bill, in full and without exception. Catherine opened her mouth to scream another defense. I cut her off with the final fatal blow, the last thing I would ever need to say to her. I hear that federal processing facilities can be quite crowded, I said, my voice dropping to a low, entirely composed whisper that somehow carried perfectly through the silence. The floor will suit you perfectly. Catherine gasped, a sharp, involuntary intake of breath, the words hitting her with the precision and force of a physical strike. She recognized her own words, her own cruelty, her own casual, gleeful dismissal of her daughter, returned to her now as a life sentence delivered in front of the world she had always wanted to impress. The federal agents did not give her time to respond. They turned her and Thomas firmly around and marched the disgraced former executives of Vanguard Estates out of the Field Museum and directly into the waiting armored transport vehicles idling at the curb. Madison watched her parents disappear through the heavy doors, her body shaking so violently she could barely remain upright. She was still kneeling on the cold stage floor, completely surrounded by the shattered, irretrievable ruins of the existence she had always taken entirely for granted. She had no husband, no parents, no mansion, no social standing, no safety net of any kind. She dropped her head into her hands and wept, left with nothing but the bitter, inescapable consequences of a lifetime of arrogance and borrowed cruelty. Two female security guards stepped forward, hoisting Madison firmly to her feet by her arms. They escorted the sobbing, ruined golden child off the stage and out through the side exit, quietly, efficiently removing the disruption from my venue. The chaos vanished with them, as though it had never existed. I turned back to face my podium and the stunned audience that remained. I offered them a warm, steady, entirely genuine smile. They rose to their feet and gave me a standing ovation. The gala resumed without further interruption, raising a record-breaking sum for mental health initiatives before the final guest departed in the small hours of the morning. Hours later, I walked out through the heavy glass doors of the Field Museum and stepped onto the grand stone stairs. The freezing Chicago night air hit my face immediately, and it felt not harsh, but incredibly, almost defiantly, refreshing. I looked out at the glittering skyline stretching before me, the city I had quietly, methodically, relentlessly conquered, and understood, with a clarity I had never quite felt before, that I was completely free. Not just legally, not just financially, completely. The heavy, suffocating chain that had bound me since childhood to their toxic expectations, their cruelty, their casual dismissal of my worth was permanently and irrevocably shattered. The next morning, my legal team finalized the full recovery of my grandfather's stolen trust fund. I did not absorb the $40 million back into Apex Holdings. Instead, I signed a single, sweeping directive. I donated every recovered penny, every cent that had been taken from me and squandered on vanity, to a newly established foundation dedicated entirely to providing aggressive legal support and comprehensive psychological therapy for victims of severe narcissistic family abuse. I would never be forced to sit on the floor again, and I was going to build something permanent to ensure that anyone who tried to push others down would find themselves facing an absolute, impenetrable fortress of consequence. I walked to my waiting car, my head held high, entirely ready to continue building the world I had constructed with my own two hands. The arc of Sienna's devastating yet ultimately triumphant journey illuminates a profound and difficult truth at the heart of toxic family dynamics. Biological ties do not guarantee unconditional love, loyalty, or basic human decency. When confronted with relentless narcissistic abuse, the most powerful and enduring response is not to engage in an emotional battle on the abuser's chosen terrain, but to quietly, methodically, and without apology, build your own absolute independence. For years, Sienna served as the designated family scapegoat, subjected to cruel, public mockery and deliberately excluded from the table of her own life. Her family sought to keep her on the floor, mistaking her strategic silence and emotional discipline for weakness. But the core lesson she embodies is this: true strength is most often forged in the deepest shadows. Instead of exhausting herself in a futile search for validation from people fundamentally incapable of providing it, she channeled her trauma into constructing something they could never reach or dismantle. She demonstrates that we cannot heal in the same environment that broke us, and we cannot reason with people who are genuinely, strategically committed to misunderstanding us. Furthermore, her story illustrates the vital, often overlooked importance of ironclad boundaries. Society frequently presents immediate forgiveness as a mandatory prerequisite for healing, a moral obligation that supersedes the victim's own safety and well-being. But Sienna shows us that establishing firm, non-negotiable limits and allowing toxic individuals to face the natural consequences of their own choices is not cruelty. It is a profoundly necessary, deeply valid form of self-love and self-preservation. Her ultimate victory was never merely the acquisition of immense wealth or the clean execution of a corporate takeover. It was the permanent severing of the emotional chains that had defined and constrained her for so long, and the deliberate, generous use of her hard-won freedom to uplift others who are still fighting their way free. You do not have to accept the floor simply because someone with power over you once declared that is where you belong. If you are standing today in the shadow of a toxic environment, uncertain, diminished, wondering whether things can change, take the first brave, imperfect step toward reclaiming your own narrative. Start building your independent future. The table was always yours.